People were unloading boxes from a truck. Who would have imagined that a person could have a replacement who does all the work for him? The guy was lifting weights in the gym. The balance of the card appeared on the phone screen. This replacement could do anything. The young man was sitting in a sun lounger on the beach. His dream came true. The boy took off his sunglasses and thought about how he had such a life. A giant dragon attacked the city. The main character fell to the ground and opened his mouth in fear. His house was almost completely destroyed. Dead monsters lay around, putting his weapon on his shoulder. The hunter asked his friend to collect all the corpses and thought about how hard he worked to get the most comfortable life. The monster hit the ground with its paw with force. The demon opened its mouth wide and screamed. The guy decided that it might seem stupid that he was doing everything possible just to eat and play for his own pleasure. The young man smiled nervously and assessed the size of the enemy. The monster's eyes lit up. The hunter frowned sternly and ordered everyone to attack. Realizing that he would never be alone, his squad charged at the monster. Two fighters jumped into the air above the enemy's head. The protagonist swung his sword. Red lightning flashed around him. The rest of his team held the demon down. Surrounded by his comrades, the boy delivered a crushing blow and thought about his special skill, cloning. A monitor was on in the dark room. A notebook was lying on the desk. There were bowls of food in the kitchen. The young man thought about how there were so many things in this life that he needed to do, but there were just as many things that he wanted to do. He was playing a computer game. The protagonist imagined himself sitting on a cliff and realized that he wanted to travel. The boy imagined clinking glasses with his friends and wanted to spend more time with them. The young man mentally took the hand of a girl and realized that he wanted to go on dates. A smile appeared on his face. He wondered why a person could only do one thing at a time and remembered that he always wanted to have two bodies. His clone appeared in front of him. His dream came true. People were walking along the busy streets. The bully smirked and said that he would definitely get a cool skill when he awakens. His comrade chuckled and said that he could use a skill that raises intelligence. Walking along the street, the boy found his life tiring. The protagonist looked away and wanted to get home as soon as possible. A crowd of people walked in front of him. He really wanted to have two bodies. The man brought the microphone to his mouth and asked for a moment of attention. The A-class hunter looked up and announced that he would be in charge of the 10th Portal Awakening program. Lightning enveloped the man's body. It turned out that this was a program launched by the government to help awaken abilities during which people must cross a portal. Waving his hand, Bonte hoped that the city's residents would successfully complete their awakening and suggested starting right now. The first group stepped forward and stood in line. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and realized that his turn would soon come. Holding documents in her hands, the girl greeted him and clarified his number and group. The guy confirmed that he was number 7 in the 37th group. The woman brought a scanner to his hand to check his identity. She pointed to the portal with her hand and asked the candidate to enter it, having previously left all his equipment here. The young man took a step forward. Bright lightning struck from the black rift. The student's eyes widened in surprise. The protagonist closed his eyes and stuck his hand into the portal. User identification began, and soon the system reported the completion of registration. Sono opened his eyes wide. Putting his hand to his head, he felt severe pain and realized that he had momentarily lost consciousness. The people found themselves in a building with drones flying under the ceiling. The guy frowned in disappointment and noticed that he wasn't the only one who felt sick. The girl summoned a fire phoenix and was happy that she got such an amazing ability. People from different guilds immediately ran up to her to recruit her. Someone approached the young man, smiling. The stranger congratulated him on waking up and asked how he was feeling. The student stood up and said that he was feeling sick. The man said that it would soon pass and asked if he had checked his skill. The protagonist frowned and said that he was just about to do that. A status window appeared in front of him. Sonu's eyes widened in surprise. He said that he had gotten the cloning skill. As soon as he thought about it, the guy looked at the values of his characteristics and was upset that they were so low. The young man raised his eyebrows and decided to check the skill description. The system reported that the maximum number of clones depends on the user's level and is currently equal to 1. The student thoughtfully scratched his chin. The awakened man's mouth dropped open in shock when he read that there were no special conditions for using this skill, and he realized that it could be used for everyday activities as well. The stranger folded his hands behind his back and decided that his friend had already finished checking his status window. The protagonist confirmed. He said that everything was not so good. Smiling, the man asked him not to be upset, since all newbies have rather weak initial indicators, and asked what his skill was. Deciding not to hide it, Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and replied that he had received cloning. The guild representative stared at him in amazement and grinned. The boy looked at him in confusion. He tilted his head and asked if it was really that bad. The stranger told him that there was a person with the illusion cloning skill, but since his clones did not have a physical shell, they could not do anything. The young man smiled and thought that his clones were not illusion. The man raised his hands and explained that this was much better than awakening without a skill, and said that he could show his skill to the officials standing nearby so they could evaluate it more accurately. The student looked around. A crowd of people had gathered behind him. The boy raised his hand and it immediately turned to stone. The representatives of the different guilds were watching him carefully. The awakened man frowned sadly. The protagonist asked where the exit was. The stranger smiled and explained that before leaving this place, he needed to undergo a final scan and register with the research team. People entered the capsule one by one. White smoke appeared around Sangwoo. The man sitting at the laptop confirmed his skill and said that the probability of manifesting one or more skills was 73%. The employee raised his eyebrows and said that he had registered the cloning skill and that the registration form had been sent to the ID bracelet. The handrails on the bus swung from side to side. The guy looked at his bracelet and thought that everything had ended faster than expected. A wave appeared on the small screen. The young man wondered what his new skill truly was. Clouds were floating above the city. The student entered the apartment and asked if his comrades had done a good job. There were several monitors on his computer desk. A battle was taking place on the screen. The awakened one sat down in a chair. He put his hands on the keyboard and decided to check something. An inventory and a description of the shield appeared on the screen, which the player did not like very much. The main character lay down on the bed and said that he did not care. Staring at the ceiling, Sangwoo thought about the fact that the popularity of games was falling anyway and decided to hope for the release of some new game. Putting his hands under his head, the guy remembered that he needed to pay for tuition and rent, and wished that someone else could get a job instead of him. The young man jumped out of bed and remembered his skill. He looked at the ID bracelet and decided to check its effect. The student stood in the center of the room. Waves of light energy appeared around him. An aura enveloped his body. The awakened one opened his eyes wide and used his skill. A blue haze flew out from his chest. The gamer opened his mouth in fear and screamed. A thick cloud of energy appeared in front of him. A bright light appeared inside it. The flash lit up the room. Someone lowered their hand. Smoke flew around his feet. An exact copy of the protagonist appeared in the room. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows in surprise. A white haze enveloped the double's naked body. He stood firmly on his feet. The guy raised his hand. The young man's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked if it was really a clone. His exact twin raised his eyebrows and confirmed it. The student approached him and asked if he could touch him. The copy allowed him to do so. The awakened one frowned tensely and thought that he was too embarrassed. He slapped himself in the face to come to his senses. The gamer grabbed the double by the shoulder. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock and realized that this was a real physical body, not an illusion. A white haze covered the groin of the completely naked clone. Sangwoo smiled and said that he needed to put something on first. There was a wrinkled sweater on the floor. The twin put it on. The guy remembered that he could give him orders. The young man thought about asking him to sit down, and the copy immediately did so. The student smiled and realized that he didn't even need to say the orders out loud. The double stood up when the awakened one mentally asked him to do so. Then the clone sat down a few more times. His face was covered in beads of sweat due to fatigue. The gamer put his hand to his chin and decided that he had the same stamina as him. The phone vibrated in his pants pocket. The protagonist took it out and saw messages from his comrade. A conversation appeared on the screen. Jando said that he had 2 hunter skills and asked his friend to answer him as soon as possible. Sangwoo started texting while his twin tried to catch his breath. In the chat, his comrade assumed that he had received some stupid ability and began to laugh at him. The guy frowned in displeasure and called him a real chatterbox. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of his face saying that his stamina had increased by 1,000. George was standing on the roof of the building. He was the owner of the Flicker skill, an S-class ranker who became the first person to pass Odine's tower, which no one had been able to conquer before. The elevator doors in the main building of the Enlightenment Group opened. The guild employee entered the office and reported that at the moment, according to the analysis, 80% of the population of 300 million people were awakened. The guild leader asked how long it would take for 100% to awake. The girl looked at the tablet and explained that, given the number of participants in the awakening program, they could expect it within the next 5 years. Looking at the city, the jumper decided that it was not that long. George was standing by the panoramic window. A giant skyscraper rushed into the sky. The protagonist went for a run. His face turned red and was covered in beads of sweat. The athletes sitting on the bench noticed him. One of them assumed that he would soon faint because he was running in such clothes. Sangwoo sat down on the bench. Someone handed him a bottle of water. The stranger smiled and offered him a drink before the next lap. The guy opened his mouth but remained silent. At that moment, the young man got up from the bench and ran on. The woman looked after him and assumed that he was just an introvert. The student ran through the park. At home, he woke up, stood on the scale, and saw that he weighed 78 kg. The slimmed-down gamer pursed his lips. His body had become a little more athletic. Scratching the back of his head, the protagonist realized that he had lost 9 kg this month despite the constant feeling of hunger, and thought that he was doing nothing, yet his body was getting better day by day. Sangwoo looked at the notifications about the increase in characteristics and decided that it was not for nothing that they say skills come from a person's hidden desires. The guy sat down in a chair and remembered that he had learned something while using clones. The young man imagined how he hit his copy and how it ran around the park and concluded that its pain and fatigue were not transmitted to him. After an exhausting run, the double melted into thin air. Clones disappear if they receive damage or spend energy above the limit. The student looked at his twin. Its appearance directly depended on the appearance of the owner. While the awakened one lay on the bed, his copy continued to exercise despite the large distance between them. The gamer clenched his fist and ordered the double to use his skill, but this was impossible. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought that this was quite logical, since otherwise he would have an infinite number of clones. Some time ago, Sangwoo was sitting at the computer in complete darkness. The hunter's wiki appeared on the monitor. The boy raised his eyebrows and realized that he never thought this day would come. A search bar appeared on the main page. It turned out that there were normal and special stats, but most awakened ones only had normal ones, and the method to unlock special stats was still unknown, with a few exceptions. A status window appeared in front of the boy. His stats increased slightly. The student smiled and thought that he was able to raise his stats so quickly because the clone was training non-stop and doing everything possible to fulfill the order until he reached the limit. The awakened one put his hand behind his head and wondered if this meant that he could double the points he got if he moved with the clone. The gamer picked up a flyer for a gym. The flyer said that this gym provided a personal trainer and a full range of exercises. The protagonist looked up from the flyer. A battle was taking place on the computer screen. Sangwoo smiled and decided that he would be the head, and his double would be the limbs. The guy unlocked his phone and looked at his balance. The young man frowned and realized that he didn't have enough money to pay for the registration. The student looked ahead and remembered that he had spent a lot of money on food. He looked away and decided that he needed to find a part-time job. The awakened one placed his hands on the keyboard. The gamer raised his eyebrows and thought that he needed to find some construction work because it would help him train his body and earn money at the same time. The protagonist looked at the list of vacancies and realized that he should do it himself first, because the clone would not be able to succeed if he was given an order in an area unknown to both of them. Sangwoo frowned with interest. A description of a vacancy appeared on the monitor for the Webtoon Logistics Center, which was looking for a delivery worker. The guy pressed the call button, considering this vacancy ideal. The young man put the phone to his ear and said that he saw an advert for workers on the website. The manager explained that there would be no preliminary interview and that he could come straight away and start working. Sitting in front of the computer, the student said that he wanted to start working tomorrow. He raised his eyebrows in surprise when the employee of the center asked if he could start working today. The awakened one looked away and answered that it was possible. The employee of the company said that he would be waiting for him at the logistics center at 6. The gamer pressed the end call button and wondered if there was no one else working there. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he did not care, as long as he was paid. The trucks left the center. Sangwoo put his hands in his pockets and assumed that this was the very place. His clone's face was hidden under a mask and a cap. The guy looked at him and decided that if he said this was his twin, something could go wrong. The young man raised his hand and asked his double to answer questions well and call himself Jundo while working. Scratching his head, the student thought that this building was too big and wondered where he should go. The awakened one raised his eyebrows in surprise when someone called out to him. The man smiled widely and asked what brought him here. The gamer opened his mouth wide and recognized him. Doc Chill. He shook his hand and said that he didn't even recognize him because he had lost weight. The protagonist thanked him and explained that he came here with a friend for a part-time job. The employee pointed at the building and said that he should go there since the office was located inside. Sangwoo scratched the back of his head and thanked him. The man said goodbye. The guy put his hands to his cheeks and thought that his nerves couldn't stand this. The young man looked through his fingers. The student asked if his copy was nervous. Number 1 looked at him and said no. The awakened one looked at his bracelet with confidence and remembered that he now had strength. The gamer went ahead and suggested that they finish their business quickly and go home to eat ramen. The exhausted protagonist lay down on the boxes and realized that he had been too confident in himself because the delivery work was too difficult. The clone took a large box. A loader was dragging the box to the car. The company employee was sorting out the cargo in the warehouse. Sangwoo raised his head with difficulty and wondered if these people really had any skill in dragging heavy things. Doc Chill extended his hands to help the double remove the box. The sweaty guy realized that he should not have come here because his copy was doing just fine on its own. There were trucks parked near the center. An hour-long break was announced. The guys were sitting by the wall of the building. The young man looked very tired. Someone handed him a can of soda. The man smiled and explained that he needed to replenish the fluids in his body. The student thanked him. A local worker sat down opposite him and asked the name of the diligent loader who had not said a word during this time. Number 1 introduced himself with a false name. The center employee smiled widely and concluded that his friend was doing this kind of work for the first time. Looking up, the awakened one confirmed this and called the work quite tiring. Sitting opposite him, Doc Chill chuckled and said that he and his friend had courage, since most of the guys would have already run away by now. The gamer tensely pursed his lips and thought that he would have been among them too if not for the money. The man looked at him and asked where he studied. The protagonist answered that he studied at Yongguk University. The clone drank the soda in one gulp. The local worker called Yongguk a great school. Sangwoo replied that he could not say the same. Looking away, the center employee asked him not to be modest and explained that he would give anything for his daughter to go there. Smiling, the guy asked him not to worry about it and told him that he also didn't do very well in school, but still managed to get in. Doc Chill raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked how he managed to do it. The young man replied that he was able to get a couple of licenses and a special permit. The man happily raised his hand and said that this was a great option. Suddenly, he thoughtfully raised his fist to his chin. The local worker smiled and asked if his friend wanted to get another part-time job. The student opened his mouth in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The center employee extended his hand and offered that he tutor his daughter instead of getting tired here. The awakened one widened his eyes in shock. The gamer thoughtfully looked away. A phone screen appeared in his memory showing the meager balance of his card. The protagonist frowned in confusion. Sangwoo extended his hand forward and asked if he would need to tutor her in all subjects. Doc Chill confirmed this and explained that he was embarrassed to say such a thing about his own daughter, but she was actually a bad student. The man spread his fingers and offered 50,000 for each 2-hour lesson, a couple of times a week. The boy looked away and decided that it wasn't that bad, considering the time it took. The boy shook his friend's hand and agreed. The local worker thanked him for his help. Standing up, he promised to contact him after discussing it with his daughter and asked if he still had his old phone number, which the student confirmed. The awakened one looked up at the sky and hoped that everything would work out with the tutoring. A notification about the increase in stats appeared in front of him. The gamer smiled widely and was happy that he got both the job and the stats. The loader left the warehouse. The protagonist turned around and remembered that he still had something to do. Sonu opened the black bag and decided to have a snack. However, the bag was empty. Number 1 was already eating his second sandwich in a row. The boy smiled nervously and closed his eyes. The clone threw an entire bag of buns into his mouth. Sitting opposite him, the young man asked if he had really eaten everything. The next morning, the student was lying on his bed. The awakened one gritted his teeth and said that he was about to die. The gamer got out of bed and decided to use the double for this part-time job from now on. A message about increasing characteristics appeared next to him. The protagonist realized that the twin was still working. Closing his eyes, Sangwoo asked him to come back and thought about how he wanted to recall him and call him again, because if he didn't do this at home, his clothes would disappear. There was a pot of soup on the table. The guy smiled broadly and was glad that he was able to eat a hearty meal. Suddenly, the young man looked down. The door of the apartment opened. Number 1 came inside and announced his return. The student looked at him in surprise and asked him to wash himself and change his clothes. Water dripped from the shower. There was dirty laundry in the basket. The awakened one approached the clone who had just come out of the shower. The gamer frowned and asked him to give him a hand. The double raised his hand. The tense protagonist took a sharp needle in his hand. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. Sonu remembered that if the copy was recalled, his body would scatter in the wind because it was not a person and not a living creature at all. The guy pierced number 1's finger with a needle. A drop of blood appeared on it. The clone looked ahead indifferently. The young man took a handkerchief and asked him for forgiveness. The rag absorbed the blood. The student wondered when the regeneration characteristic would become available to him. A description of regeneration appeared on the hunter's wiki page, which said it could be mastered by constantly leaving wounds on your body. The awakened one leaned on his hand and asked himself if this characteristic would appear if he did this for another month. The gamer pursed his lips and thought that he was afraid to inflict a wound bigger than this, so he should stop there. The protagonist looked at the doppelganger and asked him to eat ramen whenever he felt hungry and to continue training. Sangwoo handed him his spare phone and told him to take it when he went to work and to make sure to answer his calls. The sun's rays illuminated the houses. The guy was walking down the street holding an advertising flyer. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder. The young man turned his head and saw his friend. The student removed his hand and said that it was too hot today. Yando was surprised that his friend had lost so much weight. The awakened one narrowed his eyes and explained that he was working out and was on his way to the gym. Putting his hands on his stomach, the brunette said that these were also muscles and asked which gym he was going to. The gamer replied that the gym was called Strong Body. The man gave him a thumbs up and said that it was a good place. The protagonist raised an eyebrow and remarked that he didn't see anything special about it, except the price. The guy smiled broadly and said that the trainer there was a real beauty. The young man grabbed his friend by the shoulders and offered to go there together. Sunu realized that his friend didn't go there to exercise at all. Bright lamps illuminated the corridor. A pumped-up man was lifting dumbbells. Treadmills stood along the wall. An athlete was lifting a barbell. Someone was eating meat with chopsticks. The guys entered the gym, scratching the back of his head. A local employee apologized and greeted the guests. The hero said that they would like to register. The gym employees smiled and told them that they had discounts on the occasion of the opening, so if they took a subscription for 3 months, it would cost them only 160,000 kali. The guy raised his index finger and decided to take the membership. He asked if the trainer could check whether he was using each machine correctly. The man put his hands on the table, agreed to help him, and offered to assist with the payment. There were many different machines in the gym. The young man lifted the barbell with difficulty. The student stood up from the machine, and the local worker explained that this was how to do an incline bench press. He suggested that the student gradually increase the weight and speed up. An athlete lifted the barbell and screamed loudly. There were 4 50 kg plates on each side. The guys looked at the athlete in shock. The gym goer holding the dumbbell opened his mouth in surprise. The man working out on the treadmill widened his eyes in amazement. The strong man secured the barbell to the stand. Yando tensed his arm to show off his pumped-up muscles. The trainer approached him and assumed that he had been working out for a long time. The brunette replied that this was his first time. The gym employee put his hand on his chin and suggested that Jando had a power boost after awakening. He asked what his current level was. The guy replied that he had 2 units of power. The awakened guy raised his eyebrows in surprise and realized that the skill his friend had never talked about was power. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The gamer wondered how strong other high-class hunters were if a simple power boost skill had such a serious effect. Sitting on the bench, the protagonist realized that it was not for nothing that everyone only talked about hunters. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Samu picked up the phone and heard Doc Chill's voice. Holding the phone to his ear, the guy heard that his colleague had already talked about tutoring with his wife and daughter and wanted to know if he had time right now. The young man stood up and confirmed this. The man offered to meet him at their house to talk. The bright sun illuminated the city. Standing in the elevator, the student was upset that Jiando had not registered even after that performance. The brunette pointed at himself and said that his friend would not be able to work out properly if he signed up for the gym. The awakened one asked him to admit that this didn't happen only because there was no cute trainer there today. The athlete looked down and confirmed this. The gamer put his hands in his pockets and decided that it would be even better this way because he would not have to worry about the clone. There was a sign with an apartment number on the door. The protagonist realized that this was the right address. Sunu put his ear to the door and heard disgruntled shouts. It turned out that no one knew the tutor was coming. Dakseol abruptly opened the door and said that he was going to work, so his daughter could tell the tutor herself if she didn't like something. The man looked back and opened his mouth in amazement. The guy who was hit with the door put his hand to his cheek. A young girl came out into the hallway. The schoolgirl's eyes widened in surprise. The young man put a rag to his head. An employee of the logistics center approached him and apologized for not noticing him. The student replied that everything was fine. Someone put a plate of sliced apples on the table. The woman smiled broadly and said that she did not recognize the boy. The awakened one explained that he had been playing sports recently and that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The gamer removed the rag from his head. His knees trembled when the protagonist asked if she was his student. The girl blushed in embarrassment and confirmed it. Her parents smiled widely since their daughter had been complaining about tutoring just a few seconds ago. Sangwoo introduced himself and asked if she really wanted to go to Jeong's university. Looking away, the girl confirmed it and thought to herself that she was embarrassed because he had probably heard her screams. The guy smiled and said that he wanted to see her grades before classes started. The schoolgirl's mouth opened in fear. The boy nervously pursed his lips. As he picked up the report card, the penultimate column showed that the student had a rather low rating. She covered her face with her hands in shame. Dakseol carefully picked up his jacket. The man ran to the exit and shouted that he had to go to work. His wife called him a traitor. The student looked up. The girl looked sadly at the floor. The awakened one smiled and said that everything was fine and that he didn't have good SAT scores either. The girl clasped her hands and asked if that was true. Looking at her, the gamer offered to do everything possible to help her get in, and they decided to discuss the class schedule. White clouds floated above the buildings. The protagonist returned to the apartment and thought that they had a long way to go. Some time ago, Sonru poked his finger at the schoolgirl's notebook. The student began to write something diligently. The guy hung the sweater on a hanger and was glad that she was not as hopeless as expected. The young man went to the computer and decided that number one had probably already gone to work. The student raised an eyebrow and remembered that he had given him a spare phone, but if the number of clones increased in the future, he would need to buy another one. Sitting down in his chair, the awakened opened the Hunter Wiki to search for skills similar to his own. The screen showed many items being sold. The gamer flinched in shock when he saw that the familiar skill was selling for 100 million. Tears welled up in his eyes because the teleportation skill scroll was selling for 400 million. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he would buy a house instead of a skill if he had that kind of money. Sonmu leaned back in his chair looking at the screen. The boy thought about how it would take him forever to buy even one skill and wondered if hunters really made so much money that they could afford all that. The young man picked up his phone and saw that his balance was only 200,000. The student lay down on his bed and sighed heavily. The awakened placed his hands under his head and asked himself if he should become a hunter. The gamer opened the news feed on his phone to find information about hunters. He got out of bed. The protagonist frowned tensely and thought that he could not waste such a great skill on slave work. Sangwoo grabbed his sweater, put it on, and decided to try to become a hunter. The system reported the unlocking of the vitality skill. Demons came forward. In the year 2000, portals began to appear all over the earth. At the same time, an army of the undead pursued strong monsters. Because of this incident, later called the Great Catastrophe, more than half of the world's population died. The living dead leaned on his sword. At the same moment when the catastrophe began, Super people with special abilities began to appear. The Awakens stood in the shadows with them on the front lines. Humanity barely managed to win this war. A man took a crystal out of the monster's body. Now a profession for hunting the remaining monsters had appeared. These specialists began to be called hunters. The young man was watching a video on his phone. The lecturer explained that if he passed the test, he could get a state license and legally kill monsters. He put in his earphones at the moment when the teacher suggested analyzing several subtleties that would help in passing the test. The awakened man opened his mouth in surprise. Standing in front of him was a tall building that housed the Hunter Center. The gamer stretched his shoulder and thought that, due to the recently unlocked vitality skill, even a couple of hours of sleep was enough for him to feel alert. The protagonist entered the building. The arms dealer was showing a buyer a sword. Another man was assembling firearms. The stranger's face was hidden by a hat with a long brim. Sanu's eyes widened in amazement. People were walking around the building, but the guy concluded that only a few were actually there to take the test. A girl raised her hand and announced that registration for the exam to obtain a hunter's license, which would take place in the basement, would end in 20 minutes. The young man lowered his head and realized that he was very nervous. There was a sign next to the door that read exam room. The student walked in and apologized. There were many people sitting in the lecture hall, and they all stared at the awakened one. The gamer trembled and wondered why there were so many of them. A bully smirked and laughed at him along with his comrade. A man in a military uniform entered the room and put his hand on the table. Looking up, Mien greeted those present and announced that he would be their examiner. Frowning, the man explained that the licensing exam consisted of a written part, a practical test, and an aptitude test. He warned that anyone caught cheating would be disqualified without the right to retake the exam, and asked if everyone understood. The hunter looked at the lecture hall from under his brows and said, "We do not forgive cheaters?" The bully opened his mouth in amazement. The protagonist frowned tensely and felt a strong pressure. The soldier standing behind the lectern announced the start of the exam. A white car was driving along the road. A stranger said they would transfer everything by the end of the month. Shouts were heard through the earphone. Sitting behind the wheel, a man asked his boss to wait and said that he had been working in this field for several days. He closed his eyes, listening to the shouting of his superiors. The CEO of JM smiled and thought that this could drive a person crazy. The agent raised his eyebrows and said that money does not come easily but flows away like sand through your fingers. The watch on his hand showed 7:45. The man concluded that the hunter exam should be over soon. The car was driving along a long bridge. A message appeared on the identification bracelet, congratulating him on receiving F-class hunter status. The protagonist looked at it in confusion. Sony scratched the back of his head and thought that passing the exam was as easy as getting a driver's license. At first, the guy sat at the table. The questions in the written stage were very simple. You just needed to remember a couple of things. Then the guy went to the shooting range and picked up a gun. Before the practical test, they were given a lot of time to prepare, and the target was hanging quite close. Then they sat at the table with Miman. The aptitude test turned out to be a moral conversation, like something from elementary school. Looking down, the young man thought about how this job involves risking your life and using weapons, and he wondered if it was normal for the entry threshold to be so low. The student turned around. The rays of the setting sun illuminated the building. The awakened one decided that the government seemed to want everyone to become hunters. The protagonist closed his eyes and told himself that he shouldn't worry about it. On the street, people in black suits approached the new hunters. They handed out business cards to everyone who had just passed the exam. One of them held coffee in his hand and chatted pleasantly with a hunter. Sanu raised his eyebrows and assumed that they were representatives from guilds trying to recruit them. Someone handed him a business card and congratulated him on passing the license exam. The boy took the card and saw the name of Agent JM. Junmo smiled and offered to cooperate, promising to give him the best deals when buying or finding items for hunting. The young man scratched his head and thanked him. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of him. The student's eyes widened in surprise when he saw that his cloning skill level had increased and that he had another clone available. When the man started saying something about the agency, the awakened one ran away and promised to contact him later. The CEO burst into tears and asked him not to forget about it. In the evenings, lights were on in the windows of the house. The hunter covered his face with his hand and left. Number 1 stood in front of him. The protagonist decided that nothing could be better than cloning. Another double appeared from the smoke. The copies looked at each other. Sangwoo said that he was looking forward to working together. The guy showed the twins a business card and said that they were now ready to become hunters. Junmo threw the business cards onto the car seat and realized that he had given out almost all of them. The man straightened his tie and hoped that they would contact him. He looked out the window at the official representative office of Korea's leading guild towered over the city. Documents lay on the table. The employee took a sip from his mug and said that his colleague only needed to settle the amount according to what was written in the documents. The CEO of JM took them in his hands and said that he understood everything. Suddenly, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. The documents in his hands contained the total prices for different monsters. The agent, carefully studying the documents, noticed that the amount looked rather suspicious. Troll blood should cost much more. Sitting in a chair, his colleague called him over. The employee grinned and remembered that his comrade had long wanted to join the guild, which meant he should start thinking for himself. Junmo's eyes widened in surprise. The man put the mug on the table and asked, "What will we be left with if we follow all the rules?" The employee put his hand on his colleague's shoulder and asked him not to interfere in the internal affairs of the guild. The CEO of JM tensely clutched the documents in his hand. Sitting in the car, he thought that he would have kept quiet if he had known how hard it would be for him. The phone rang in the inside pocket of his jacket. The agent stuck his hand in to take it out. Junmo put the phone to his ear. The protagonist introduced himself and said that he would like to clarify a few things. There were many signs on the buildings. The man entered a cafe. Sangwoo, who was sitting at the table, called him over. The CEO of JM sat down across from him and apologized for being late. The guy replied that he had just arrived. The cashier was standing behind the counter. The two decided to order a drink. There was iced coffee on the table. Smiling, the agent asked if his client would like to go to a territory that even a newbie could handle. Upon hearing an affirmative answer, he asked permission to know his skill. Holding the coffee in his hand, the young man replied that his skill was cloning. Junmo put his hand to his chin and remembered that this was a skill that created illusions incapable of doing anything. The student drank all the coffee in one gulp. The man realized this was a newbie with illusions that were physically incapable of anything and wouldn't help in hunting. Handing him the documents, the CEO of JM called his skill excellent and asked him to read the terms of the contract. With his arms outstretched, the agent recommended the slime hunting grounds because they had the least dangerous monsters. He explained that one must wear a mask and protective clothing to enter, and that they should not stay there too long because of the toxic fumes. The awakened one took a picture of the contract and said it would not be a problem for him. Junmo raised his hand and added that there was also the horned hare hunting grounds, which had a safe barrier for shooting. However, the prey was hard to catch, making it very difficult to earn money. The hunter carefully studied the contract. The man said that there were also low-class monsters such as giant rats, but only the aforementioned monsters lived in areas where his company could guarantee safety. The protagonist raised his eyebrows and said that he liked both places and that the price of the items for sale also looked attractive. The Sangwoo placed the documents on the table and said he wanted to enter into the contract. The CEO smiled and thanked him. He picked up the notebook and asked which territory the client would choose. The guy stamped it and thought the agent had misunderstood something. The manager winced when he saw that someone else had stamped it. A red mark appeared on the document. Junmo looked away in surprise. The boy smiled and explained that he would be hunting in both places at once. A while ago, a man sitting in his office had asked if his client had the cloning skill. The man in the ninja suit confirmed it. The CEO of JM raised his hand and asked him to show his ability. The awakened one raised 2 fingers and agreed. 2 illusions appeared next to him. Lightning flashed in the office. 4 copies of the skill owner appeared behind him. The agent smiled happily. The clone pulled out a sword from behind his back. The doubles pointed the weapon at their master. The manager raised his eyebrows and asked them to stop. The copy swung the sword. Several blades pierced the hunter at once. Junmo covered his face with his hand in horror. The client asked him to calm down. The man looked at him tensely. The awakened one passed his hand through the sword and explained that it was not real. The CEO of JM tried to touch the sword, but his hand passed through the blade. The clones turned into white smoke. Their master said that this was a good skill to distract monsters. The agent covered his face with his hand and sighed heavily, saying that he had seen enough. Now the manager opened his mouth in shock. He thought about the cloning skill he had just witnessed. It was definitely related to illusions. In front of him sat a double of the main character. Jun Mo remembered how he had held the contract in his hands. In his memory, the copy even drank a glass of coffee. The man gritted his teeth and realized that he had never encountered anything like this before. The CEO of JM looked up and assumed they were twins. Sangwoo closed his eyes and left. The guy pointed at his clone and decided that was a reasonable assumption. The young man placed his hand on the shoulder of the double. He had an indifferent expression. The student explained that his skill could actually be confused with another, but it was not an illusion. The awakened one raised his eyebrows and said that he had another copy, but it was currently at the fitness center. The agent opened his mouth in surprise and asked if clones could really build muscle. Showing him his biceps, the hunter confirmed this and added that his own body also became stronger thanks to it. The manager realized that his client could raise his stats with the help of his doubles. Putting his hand on his chin, Junmo called it amazing and decided that this man had great potential since his skill was completely incompatible with an F-class rating. The protagonist placed his hands on his waist and suggested returning to the issue of the hunting grounds. Sanu raised his hands and asked if there could be problems due to the same person entering two places at once. The man raised his eyebrows and said that there could indeed be issues with this, since there was a record at each entrance. The boy shed tears and decided that his plan wouldn't work. Pointing behind him, the JM CEO promised to talk to the association to find a way to solve the problem. He asked if the client could come with him to scan the bracelet and demonstrate his skill. The boy scratched his head and warned that he would not be able to use the skill until tomorrow evening due to the cooldown. Looking at him and his clone, the agent suggested meeting at the Hunter Center in 2 days. The manager took a pen and remembered the contract. The student picked up the seal and reminded him that he had already stamped the documents. Junmaro suddenly stood up from the table. The man extended his hand and said that he was looking forward to their cooperation. The awakened one smiled. They shook hands. The hunter looked at the man and said that the feeling was mutual. 2 days later, clouds were floating above the skyscraper. The protagonist looked around. Sanu looked back when someone called out to him. The JM executive adjusted his tie and noticed that his client had arrived quite early. The guy explained that he thought they were expecting him and asked if it was true that the association was located in the hunting center. The agent raised his hand and replied that most of the departments operated in that building. A small device issued a ticket with a number. There were many people in the building. A voice invited numbers to different windows. The center employee raised his eyebrows and asked if the visitor really wanted dual access to the hunting areas. Sitting opposite him, the young man confirmed this and explained that he had the cloning skill, but the identification bracelet only existed in one copy. The employee said that he was the first since the jumper to request a duplicate. While the employees were looking for the necessary documents, the student tensely pursed his lips and decided that this was quite expected, since it was not a typical situation. Sometime later, the worker putting a pile of papers on the table explained that it was an application for a permit and asked the visitor to go to the government office to fill out the necessary documents. The heroes opened their mouths in amazement when they saw how many papers there were. Taking them in his hand, the manager promised to sort them out and asked his client to go to the showroom. The awakened one thanked him. Junmo handed the documents to the center employee. The hunter approached the girl in a robe. Lightning flashed around him. A completely naked clone appeared in front of him. The protagonist opened his mouth in fear. The woman adjusted her glasses. The mechanic was working on the machine. The engineer carefully looked at the bracelet. The old man raised his thumb and said that now the doubles could enter the hunting area by scanning their fingerprints. He handed Sang the bracelet and explained that they took into account the possibility of simultaneous entry and exit from different places, as well as repeated entry. The man put his hands on his shoulders and said that his skill had not been seen before, not only in Korea but in the whole world. The guy hugged his double and said that it was time for them to go. The mechanic frowned in disappointment and thought that he would make a great research subject. The young man raised his hand and said that he had settled everything. The CEO of JM congratulated him. The student smiled, glad that the preparations for the solo hunt were finally complete. Raising his eyebrows, the agent confirmed this and asked if his client was going there right now. The awakened one said that he had no other business today anyway. The manager crossed his arms and asked why his copy was hidden behind a mask. The hunter replied that he didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to it. Someone was watching their conversation from the balcony. The stranger standing in the shadows chuckled. Hyung scratched the back of his head, surprised to see this person here. Jin Mo looked back when someone called his name. There was a bang on the balcony. The guild leader jumped down. He smirked and stated that it had been a while since they had seen each other. The protagonist frowned sternly. The man furrowed his brows in disbelief, surprised that his colleague was still dealing with hunters. Sangwoo looked up and realized that the man had just jumped from several stories. The CEO of JM tensely pursed his lips. The agent bit his lower lip and said, "Hello." The scoundrel clutched his stomach and laughed at him. Hyun looked down at him and asked who that boy was. The manager frowned and replied that he was a hunter affiliated with their company. The guild leader raised his eyebrows. The man looked at the boy wearing a hoodie with a large inscription and said that everything was clear to him. He looked down appraisingly. The boy was wearing simple black pants and sneakers. The student looked away in displeasure when the villain suggested that he was only 5th class. He uncovered his face with his hand and decided that his colleague who used to work with C and B-class hunters had completely gone crazy. The guild leader opened his mouth wide and laughed because he couldn't believe that his comrade was supervising an F-class person, and in such an awful hoodie. Junmo's eyes widened in anger. The awakened one placed a hand on his shoulder, a smile shining on his face. The man wiped away a tear. He loomed over the hunter like a menacing shadow and noticed that he apparently had something to say. The protagonist closed his eyes and grinned. Sangwoo rubbed his nose and said that he was very honored to meet the head of the guild, which is considered the first in the country. The villain put his hand to his chin and was glad that there was at least some common sense in his words. The boy covered his face with his hand and declared that his guild was the first in dungeon monopoly and hunting area bans. Hyung looked up. A malicious grin appeared on his face when the boy said that he couldn't believe he was receiving praise from the guild leader who had the highest payout ratio in his favor. The student smiled widely and declared that he didn't even know what to do now. The man scratched the back of his head and called him quite brave. His eyes sparkled. Suddenly, the villain appeared behind the awakened one and asked if his skills were the reason for his bravery. The hunter turned around in fear. The man in the black suit opened his mouth wide and called out to his boss. The assistant ran up to the boss. He was upset that the funbreaker had come. The guild leader let the protagonist go and decided to call it a day. He smirked and asked his name. Sanu raised his eyebrows and suggested that he find out for himself. The man waved his hand, calling him funny, and promised to see his colleague next time. The scoundrel headed toward his employee, who asked him not to act like that inside the building anymore. The heroes were sitting in the car. Jun Mo smiled awkwardly and thanked his friend for his actions. The guy leaned on his hand and explained that he couldn't just stand there and watch. From the driver's seat, the man asked if he knew about his relationship with the Hyam Guild. The young man raised his hand and said that he found out about it while researching the agency. Sitting at the computer, the student noticed that there wasn't much information about him online, but he did find one rumor that concerned his agent. An article from the Hunter Wiki appeared on the screen, where a user wrote that the JM representative was a former Hume Guild employee and warned that those who signed a contract with him would face the road to hell. Holding the steering wheel, the manager realized why no one was joining them anymore. The awakened one explained that people were simply afraid of being targeted by a large guild. Jun Moy asked why the client chose their agency in that case. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The hunter threw up his hands and said that it was all because of the favorable payment ratio. His clone was sitting in the back seat. The protagonist smiled and added that he could trust his comrade if he didn't like something about this industry or the guild. The man's hands shook. The car drove along the highway. There were treadmills in the gym. The athlete's bloody hands were bandaged. His pumped-up legs trembled from the strain. Number 1 was lifting a heavy barbell. The trainer bit his nail in fear. The girl approached him and asked if the man would be okay. The gym employee said that he had already tried to talk to him, but it was pointless. The clone stopped when the notification sounded. The double put the barbell on the rack. He picked up the phone. The owner asked him to finish the workout and wait for him at the entrance to the gym. The copy drank a bottle of water in one gulp. The woman put her hand to her chest and noticed that the visitor had finally finished. Her colleague was happy with the news. Slugs were crawling on the ground. They were crawling along the walls and ceiling of a deep cave. Suddenly, something hit a slug. The man was holding a large sledgehammer in his hand. The awakened one pointed a device, similar to a vacuum cleaner, at the slime. The capsule behind him was almost full. The hunter came out of the portal. The protagonist took off his gas mask and sighed heavily. Junmo approached him and asked how he was doing. Sano replied that it was very difficult to breathe with the mask on. The man crossed his arms and explained that people usually did not come here even though the slug area was considered safe. The boy looked at his torn glove and concluded that he could not last very long here. The young man looked around. The JM executive explained that they could hunt here until the container was full and then simply replace it in the locker. But even a person with great endurance could not last more than 6 hours here. The agent scratched his chin and said that it was possible to stay longer if he purchased a good gas mask and higher class equipment. The student frowned and said that he could hardly last even 2 hours here, let alone 6. The awakened one pointed to his clone and offered him to do it. A gas mask flew into number 2's face. The double tied the laces on his boots. He pulled on rubber gloves. The hunter clenched his fist and wished him luck. As the copy went after the slugs, the protagonist turned his head and decided to head to the field with the rabbits. Sangwoo turned around to call number 1, but he was not there. The boy pouted and remembered that he forgot to pick him up from the gym. The twin was waiting patiently at the entrance to the gym. The clone raised his eyebrows. A white car stopped on the side of the road. The boy looked out the window and asked him to get in. The sun was almost setting. The student winced when Junmo asked why his client called the doppelgangers by numbers. The awakened one smiled and explained that they all looked the same, so giving them interesting names would be confusing. The man raised his eyebrows and agreed that names were not that important when it came to regular copies. The hunter frowned tensely and remembered that pistols were used to hunt horned hares, and the JM CEO confirmed this. The protagonist pouted and asked if he didn't need to prepare some equipment in that case. The agent looked away and said that he didn't need to worry about that. He explained that he could use his own gun or rent the necessary items at the hunting grounds. The manager presented a bunch of different weapons and added that his client would have to get his own equipment because the rented items could only be used at the hunting grounds. Suddenly, Sanu opened his mouth in surprise and asked what that sound was. Junmo smiled and said that they had arrived. There was a military base at the Yugonsen grounds. Soldiers were guarding the outer walls. The traffic controller was waving red batons. The guy got out of the car and remarked that this place was nothing like the slug's territory. The man pointed forward and explained that this was the famous Yugon's territory where the first monster breakthrough occurred. The young man scratched his chin and thought about what he had heard before. The monsters burst out of a rift in the sky. Usually the portals did not allow monsters to leave, which is why most of the hunting took place inside. The demon pounced on the man with the machine gun. In some cases, they managed to pass through the barrier and destroy the surrounding area. Waves of bright energy swept around the rift. This is what is called a monster breakthrough. Standing by the car, the CEO of JM explained that 5 years had passed and most of the high-ranking monsters had been defeated, but there were still effing rank monsters in the territory, so this place was revered by hunters. The student opened his mouth in amazement and asked if no one complained about this noise. The heroes entered the building. There were many people inside. The agent pointed to the gunsmith and said that everything you need can be rented here. A box of ammunition fell on the table. The base employee picked up a rifle and said that with night vision goggles, earplugs, and bullets, it would cost 700,000. Clutching a credit card, the awakened decided that this was a bit much. Waving his hand, Jun Mo explained that most of it was for the bullets, which would pay for themselves if they successfully hunted rabbits. He added that the price for one horn was comparable to a bucket of tears. As they went up the escalator, the man said that their place was on the 3rd floor of Building F. The hunter asked if the area was divided into zones even inside. The CEO looked back and said that they had arrived. He covered his ears with his fingers when a loud gunshot rang out. People were sitting on the edge of the building firing rifles. A stranger smoked cigarettes and complained about constantly missing. Another awakened held a dead rabbit in his hands. There were several carcasses in a black bag. The protagonist raised his eyebrows in surprise. The agent pointed to his place. The manager squatted down and asked if his client was sure of his shooting skills. Sangwoo pulled out a rifle and smugly confirmed it. The guy looked at the gun and said that he had only missed 3 times during the license exam. Jong-mo remembered that the targets there were quite close. The young man closed his eyes and said that he even felt a little sorry for the horned rabbits. The student put on earplugs. The awakened took aim and said that they would not be able to escape his eagle gaze. The man clenched his fist and was glad that everyone here had earplugs. The hunter took aim at the animal. He opened his mouth wide and shouted that he had found one. It seemed that the hare was looking straight at the sight. The protagonist slowly pulled the trigger. The cartridge case flew into the air. The hunt began. 3 hours later, night had fallen, but gunshots were still ringing out at the military base. Sangwoo covered his face with his hands. The boy lowered his head and realized that he hadn't hit the target even once. The young man threw his head back and declared that it didn't make sense. At that moment, the scope was pointing right at the rabbit's head. The animal raised its ears when the gunshot rang out. The animal immediately ran away. The student closed his eyes and was upset that they were so fast. Not long before, the CEO of JM approached him and said that it was time for him to go. Looking at the night sky, the awakened one realized that he hadn't even recouped the cost of the bullets and decided that he'd had enough for today. Number 1 looked back when the owner called out to him, sitting in a chair. The hunter asked him to shoot rabbits with a gun, take their bodies with a harpoon, and send him a message with the number 1 if he succeeded. The protagonist looked down in disappointment. Inside, heavily, the floodlights illuminated only a small part of the area. Sangwoo decided to go home. Lying in bed, the guy looked at his status window. The young man put his hands on his chest and was glad that number 2 was doing a great job dealing with the slugs. The student raised his eyebrows and noticed that his stats continued to rise in the memory. Young approached him from behind and smirked. The awakened one closed his eyes and thought that he still had a long way to go. The hunter covered his mouth with his hand and yawned. In his mind, the horned rabbit showed him the middle finger. The protagonist decided that catching these monsters unexpectedly turned out to be a complete failure for him. He stared at the ceiling. Sangwoo closed his eyes and hoped that number 1 would catch at least 1 hare. The screen of the phone lying next to his pillow lit up. Many messages appeared on it. The phone vibrated because the clone was sending many messages with the number 1. Clouds floated above the city. There were many signs on the walls of the building. Jun-mo looked out the window. The phone in his pants pocket vibrated. The man picked it up and said hello. Holding the phone to his ear, the CEO heard someone ask if this was the agency Hunter Sangwoo belonged to. The agent frowned and confirmed it. The manager of the slime territory asked him to come over right away and stop his client. The manager's eyes widened in shock when he learned that the clone had been hunting for 24 hours. Jun-mo grabbed his jacket and said that he would come as soon as he could. The guy got up from his bed and said that he had had a really good nap. The young man looked at his phone and noticed the messages, thinking that his double had run out of bullets. Sitting in the lotus position, the student read the messages. The awakened one's eyes widened in shock and asked why there were so many of them. The hunter's mouth dropped open in amazement. The man entered the slime territory and raised his eyebrows in confusion. There were many vials of red liquid on the floor. The CEO of Jam put his hand to his chin and wondered if the double had filled all the tanks in just one day. The men in hazmat suits ran up to their colleague. Blood began to flow from the holes in his gas mask. The agent immediately put the phone to his ear. The protagonist picked up the phone and asked what had happened, smiling widely. The manager reported that his copy had filled all the slime storage facilities in 24 hours and asked him to call number 2 back, as they were going to call in the cleaners. Sangwoo smiled awkwardly and asked if he could send the cleaners to Yu-gain as well. There were dead rabbit bodies on the floor. The shocked men surrounded the pile of corpses. The guy said that it was already difficult to get through. The stranger crossed his arms over his chest and said that he couldn't even count them. Someone was filming the rabbits on a camera. Number 1 sat on a chair. No one could believe that he managed to catch all those rabbits by himself. Someone approached him and said that his skills were simply incredible. The man handed him a business card and introduced himself. Baek put his hand on his chest and asked if the hunter belonged to any guilds. The clone silently looked forward. The leader of the recruiting team smiled nervously and decided that he needed to be patient, since most talented people were very strange. The man behind him crossed his arms and left. There was a crowd of representatives from different guilds nearby. One of them explained that this man was not going to talk to anyone at all. The Brown Bear Guild member opened his mouth in surprise. The men began to curse. At this time, the young man placed a container next to his double. The awakened one looked up and said that these were extra bullets. There were many bullets in the box. The hunter asked the double to continue hunting and hand over the corpses to the agent. The protagonist put his hand on his shoulder and praised him for his excellent work. The twin raised his hands in joy. Number one picked up the rifle. The people around him opened their mouths in surprise when they saw that he had started hunting again. They crowded around him and decided to watch him hunt. There were many books on the shelf. Sangwoo realized that he had underestimated the capabilities of his clones. There were study supplies on the table. The guy thought about the fact that the doubles now receive 50% of his characteristics, which means that they must be half as weak as him. Holding a pen, the boy noticed that they were distinguished by an automatic desire to complete a task and the ability to make a decision without hesitation. The student dropped the pen when someone called out to him and asked what was wrong. Hyung tilted her head and asked what he was thinking. After handing her a piece of paper, the awakened one apologized and said that her results had improved since their last meeting. The girl was happy about this but still wanted an answer to her question. The protagonist leaned on his hand and told her that he had visited the hunting grounds and that everything had gone much better than expected. The girl gaped in surprise and asked if he was a hunter. She stood up from the table and said that she did not know about it. The schoolgirl picked up the phone and asked if her teacher knew the hunter that everyone was talking about on the internet. Sanu asked who exactly she was talking about. The boy choked when the student showed him a video of the god of shooting, the eagle Jensen. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked who they were talking about. The video showed a pile of corpses. Hai said that everyone on the internet was going crazy because of it, and that this person had already killed over 200 rabbits by the time the video was recorded, which was enough to set a new record. People were filming number one on their phones, but the clone didn't say a word when they tried to ask him questions. The double pulled on his cap and only said Eagle Eye Jensen. The people around him decided that this was his nickname. The student's mouth fell open in horror. Looking at the phone, the girl said that she really dreamed of becoming a hunter. The main character asked if she had managed to wake up. The girl looked away and replied that she had received a license but was afraid to go to the hunting grounds. She pursed her lips. The schoolgirl tucked her hair behind her ear and asked if her teacher could go hunting with her if she managed to get a good grade. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and promised to take her with him, only if she could get into the university. The student smiled happily and asked if it was true. The guy confirmed it and said that he also knew some safe hunting grounds. Haijai raised her little finger and asked him to make her a promise. The boy smiled. The heroes hooked each other's little fingers. The girl raised her eyebrows and hoped that he would not change his mind. A gust of wind lifted the curtains. The student asked her friend to continue in the same spirit, and then she would definitely be able to get into Jungkook. After a while, someone opened the door. His mother turned around and opened her mouth wide. Sangwoo smiled and said that the lesson was already over. I was eavesdropping behind the door and heard the protagonist calling her talented and saying that there was nothing to worry about. Sangwoo turned around and said that he would come on Monday. Hang was sweating profusely from excitement. She immediately jumped on the bed, mentally exclaiming that they would have another meeting. The girl looked at the bright sphere and said that he was a hunter, and thanks to this, their communication went smoothly. She smiled and thought that at first she did not like this idea because he was an acquaintance of her father. She remembered his appearance. The girl remembered how he pointed his finger at the notebook and explained something. Hey! Remembered how he smiled. She blushed deeply, thinking that he was kind, explained well, and was also handsome. She lowered her head then the girl raised her head and exclaimed that she needed to study. After a while, night fell. The protagonist entered the shelter and wondered if they had finished collecting corpses. Director Junmo opened his mouth wide when he saw the protagonist. The protagonist approached them and asked if they were here too. Junmo raised his hand and asked him where he had been, since he was supposed to be checking on the gathering, and the protagonist replied that he had been tutoring. A man picked up a monster carcass, and Junmo said that he had called the gathering team to many hunting grounds many times before. The workers were putting the monster carcasses into boxes, and Junmo said that this was the first time he had called so many people to gather horned rabbits. Indeed, there were many workers standing there, namely 352 people. Junmo crossed his arms and asked if Sangwoo had checked the settlement he had sent, and the young man picked up his phone and said that he had turned off notifications, so he hadn't seen it yet. He looked and saw that he had received over 30 million won from the agency. He opened his mouth wide and screamed. The protagonist smiled and asked if it was really supposed to be that much. Junmo widened his eyes and said that his hunting skills were above F class, so he changed the calculation to 83%, which is equivalent to E class. The protagonist put his hand to his head and thanked him. Suddenly, a man opened his mouth and called out to them. They all turned around. The man pointed his finger at him and asked if he was the manager of that worm. He pointed his finger at the clone of the protagonist. Junmo stood in front of him and asked the man who he was. The man frowned and said that he was a hunter whose prey was stolen. He looked at the machine gun and said that all the horned rabbits he aimed at were killed by him, so today's hunt was a complete failure. He grabbed his shoulder and said that he thought they should compensate him for his expenses. A drop of sweat rolled down Junmo's cheek. He put his hand on his chin and told the protagonist that they seemed to have chosen the wrong spot. The protagonist said that he didn't know there were people like that. He put his hand on his chin. The protagonist thought about it, looked at him, and said that he had an idea. The man frowned and wondered with displeasure what they were whispering about. He extended his hand and said that he had a conscience and therefore he only wanted 10% of the profits. The protagonist's mouth opened wide. The stranger frowned and asked why he was laughing. Sangwoo put his hand on his clone's shoulder and said that the guy wouldn't be coming for a few days. He then pointed to the side and told Mr. Junmo that they needed to go, but the man started yelling angrily. They passed him and the protagonist asked why they didn't go sit at the coffee shop on the corner. The stranger grinned terribly in anger. He raised his hand and shouted for Sangwoo not to ignore him. The protagonist frowned and number one's eyes lit up. His fist was right in the clone's face. The man punched the protagonist's clone. The clone flew back from the punch, hit several boxes like a ball, and eventually slammed into the wall and stopped. Blood started coming out of number one's mouth. The man opened his mouth wide and shouted that he hadn't hit him that hard. Sangwoo was holding his phone and shouting about how cruel the man was. He opened his mouth wide and started talking about how this was an act of violence on a sacred hunting ground, so people wouldn't let it go that easily. The stranger looked around and was very worried. The protagonist closed his eyes and exclaimed that it would be really bad if this video leaked online. At the same time, he thought that it would be shocking news. The man frowned and lowered his head. The protagonist showed him the video. The man stood with his head down and Sangwoo suggested that they part ways on good terms. The man suddenly bared his teeth and finally resigned himself to it. After a while they were sitting in a cafe. The protagonist opened his eyes wide and asked about the Hong Guild. Junmo pointed and said that he thought the hunter who attacked him today belonged to that guild. The clone was also sitting next to them and Junmo said that since the Hong Guild is huge, all kinds of people gather there. The protagonist extended his hand and asked how Junmo knew that the man was from the Hong Guild. The agent remembered the man sitting behind him and so he said that the hunter had been keeping an eye on him ever since he came to collect the corpses. A tear rolled down his cheek and he became worried about something. The protagonist frowned and said that he understood that they might want revenge. Junmo closed his eyes and said that they did this because they thought that his clone was another hunter who had made a contract with them. Even before that, the hunters of the JEM agency were being bullied. Sangwoo drank juice while the agent talked about how they did not stay with them for long and that everyone was leaving. At the moment, only a few F-class hunters remained, including the protagonist. He lowered his head and said that even now he cannot promise that there will be no more problems from the Heesung Guild. The protagonist handed over a glass and asked not to force him to change his mind because he already knew everything but still joined, so Junmo did not need to worry. A drop of sweat rolled down the man's cheek. Sangwoo widened his eyes and said that he would not let them get away with this. Then the protagonist smiled and said that he had a plan to become stronger in a short time. He raised his hands and began to talk. Junmo looked at him in surprise. They continued to sit at the table and discussed the plan. After a while, the protagonist smiled and asked Junmo what he thought about it. The man put his hand to his chin and said that he had never thought about it. He started writing something in a notebook and said that he was free tomorrow afternoon. He suggested meeting at a hunter shop. There were many hunters in the building. The trade in weapons, armor, and other items for hunting was active from the very beginning. Many hunters were walking around the shop. These department stores had gotten into the hunting industry, taking over a large part of the market. Thanks to this, you could find everything you could imagine there. The protagonist put on the armor. The consultant extended his hand and said that this protective gear was made of titanium. It would provide the protagonist with guaranteed protection from E-class monsters. Sangwoo smiled and said that the armor was quite light and comfortable, so he liked it. He picked up a knife. Sangwoo tested its sharpness and said that he would be mastering pistols, so he thought that was enough. He turned around and asked the consultant to give him 2 more sets of weapons and armor. After a while, he was holding a suitcase with equipment in his hands. Junmo looked at him and reminded him that the protagonist also said he needed skills. The protagonist looked away and said that he was looking for familiar skills, although he was not sure if there was one there. Then, they entered a store. There was a shiny sphere on the table. The protagonist looked at the display case. He looked at the sphere and happily exclaimed that this was what he was looking for. The protagonist looked at the description of the item, which allows the hunter to share his senses and vision with the creatures and pets he summoned. However, this item cost about 13 won, though the protagonist covered his eyes with his hand. He waved his hands and said that he thought it was time to take their relationship to the next level. Junmo looked at his phone and said that he wasn't sure if it was enough, but he thought he could lend the protagonist 50 million won right now. The protagonist smiled and said that he thought he could handle the rest. He looked at the sphere again and told him not to worry. In the reflection, he could see Sangwoo's face saying that if things didn't go as planned, they would recoup their investment in no time. After a while, he put the items on the floor. Sangwoo was reading the instructions. He opened his eyes wide and said that they needed to pour mana into the sphere, and for users who couldn't control mana, they needed to turn on the sphere while keeping it in contact with their body. The protagonist picked up a remote control and wondered if it was a power button. He placed his hand on the sphere. His face was tense, and his hand was shaking. Sangwoo closed his eyes and pressed a button. A bright light lit up the room. Nothing could be seen because of the strong light, and after a moment the system notified them that a new level 1 skill had been created. Sangwoo looked at his hands in shock. Then he looked to the side and found that the skill ball had disappeared. The youth clenched his fists and mentally said that the skill was now ready to use. He knelt down and ordered the clones to come over. The clones began to walk toward him. They were dressed in the armor that Sangwoo had bought for them. The protagonist looked at them and said that it was time for them to go. After a while, Sangwoo raised his hands and asked Junmo what he thought of the results of the hunt. Junmo raised his hand and said that, of course, everything went great and he did not expect such a result. The protagonist frowned and said that, like him, the endurance, agility, and clones were only half his capabilities, but one of them killed more than 300 rabbits. A man punched the clone in the face. The clone flew back, and the protagonist mentally said that he had ordered the clone to get hit and suffer from it in the most dramatic way. Besides, it is not that easy to calculate the timing perfectly and fearlessly put your face in front of a punch. The protagonist looked at Junmo and said that he thought the man could actually punch the clone in the face if he wanted to. Junmo widened his eyes and asked if Sangwoo was saying that despite their low stats, they were able to control the clones better. The protagonist gave a thumbs up and said that he would take advantage of this. He gave 2 fingers and said that they needed to visit 2 places first. He started talking about a training ground where he was going to learn long-range and close-range attacks using weapons. A man in a kimono looked at them and happily asked if they really came to register. The man in the cap smiled and exclaimed that he would now prepare everything for them to learn how to shoot. 2 clones also walked with the protagonist and trained. The 2 men looked at them in shock because in the first case they decided to immediately move on to sparring, and in the shooting range they immediately wanted to pick up a gun and start shooting. The man knocked the stick out of the sparring partner's hands and said that they needed to attack the hand so that the opponent would drop the stick. Then the man turned around and asked if he was a hunter, but did he really want to fight right away? The shooting instructor took his cap in his hand and asked if they knew what clay pigeon shooting was and if they were sure they wanted to take a gun. The clones frowned and said that they were sure of it. The second one held sticks in his hands and the first one held a real gun. The man picked up the remote control and said that they were starting. The trainer in the kimono held his hand out in front of them and started the countdown. And so, one of them began to fight, and the second one began to shoot at the clay pigeons from the shooting range. The second one hit the bald man with a stick. The first clone hit the plate, and it shattered into pieces. The coach's eyes widened in surprise. The shooting instructor looked up in shock. The second clone held sticks in his hands. The first one held a gun. Sangwoo was drinking juice at the table and talking about how he needed the familiar skill. Junmo's eyes widened in shock, and he wondered. The agent looked at the protagonist in surprise and asked if this wasn't a skill for sharing vision with a pet. Sangwoo replied that it wasn't just for that. He pointed and said that it was important that all senses were combined, including smell and touch. The protagonist stood in front of several tin cans while thinking about how he could use this skill while his clones were training, fighting, or shooting. Sangwoo closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. Everything around him darkened, and he thought that he could experience everything. Meanwhile, the first clone was fighting. A bald man was running toward him. The second one frowned, then immediately lowered his head back and dodged the blow. The protagonist said that he could feel the angle of the joints and the balance of the body. The clone dodged back. Then the clone raised his head, and the protagonist felt the movement of each muscle and the flow of power. Meanwhile, the first clone took out a gun. He pointed it forward, and the protagonist felt the aim in the direction of the gaze. The clone fired. The plate appeared in the sky. The bullet broke the plate into pieces. A blue aura emanated from Sangwoo. His eyes were closed. He closed his eyes. The protagonist smiled and said that he could have all of this. The aura was still raging around him. He looked at his hand. Sangwoo lowered his head and thought about the experience he had just had. He remembered the air pressure when a stick flew past. He also thought about the smell of gunpowder and the force of the recoil. His hand was shaking. He felt tired. He imagined himself as if he were a puppet, and thought that, of course, he did not move a muscle. All the work was done for him by his clones, and he only shared their feelings. The protagonist imagined how to aim and mentally said that he experienced the movements of clones who had the same body as him. Sangwoo looked at his hand and thought that he could imitate these movements right now. Then the system notified him that his strength and reaction speed had increased. The protagonist warmed up his hands and said that today he would try sparring and shooting. He closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. The action moved to the gym. The clone of the protagonist was holding sticks in his hands. A man in a kimono was standing opposite him. The protagonist frowned and realized that this man looked strong. The men around them were surprised that the trainer was going to spar with the newbie himself. They stood opposite each other. Then the protagonist knocked one of the sticks out of his hands. He struck from above. The man frowned and parried the attacks. Thinking that the clone's strikes did not feel experienced, it seemed that he was not used to The clone dodged the attack, and so the man realized that defense was a completely different matter because the clone predicted his movements and perfectly dodged his attacks. The man raised his hand up and struck with the stick, but the clone blocked the attack. The clone looked at him from below. Then he immediately swung his hand. They crossed sticks and the clone looked at him closely. The man frowned and thought that this attack was quite strong. The clone had immediately copied his fighting style. The coach frowned and looked at him. He hit the clone from above, but the clone dodged. The men opened their mouths wide in surprise. The clone immediately swung his stick and hit the coach in the chest. The coach bared his teeth in pain. He turned around and realized that he had hit a wall. The protagonist raised his hand above himself and was about to attack. For some reason, the coach smiled. He immediately bounced off the wall and found himself in the air. The protagonist opened his eyes in shock. The coach hit him in the arm and broke his sticks. The man frowned and looked down. Everyone around smiled and said that their coach was no slouch either, but it was a very close fight. The protagonist cried from the pain in his wrist. The coach smiled and said that it was dangerous. He held out the stick and asked if the protagonist wanted to continue. A drop of sweat rolled down Sangwoo's cheek, and he asked the clone if he was okay. The clone lowered his head. In an instant, he was right above the coach. All the men in the room opened their mouths wide in surprise. The coach also opened his mouth wide. The protagonist looked down and asked if he wanted to continue. The protagonist knelt down. He then stood up, picked up the stick, and said that he wanted another fight. The coach closed his eyes and agreed to it. The protagonist looked ahead and said that it was time to switch to numbers 2. A blue aura appeared around number 1. In an instant, the plate shattered into pieces. A man smiled and braggingly asked his girlfriend if she saw what he did. The girl smiled happily and exclaimed that he was very cool. The protagonist frowned and thought about not saying anything. Sangwoo looked at the second clone in shock and mentally said that the clone was even shooting at the targets of the person behind him. He opened his eyes wide and realized that he needed to concentrate on shooting. The plate was in the air. The clone raised his gun, and the protagonist thought about fixing the position of his upper body. He aimed and thought about not moving, only turning in the direction of movement, following the trajectory of the plate. The plate was already in the sights, and Sangwoo thought that when the target and the expected trajectory converged, he needed to shoot. The plate shattered into pieces. Smoke came out of the barrel of the gun. The clone raised his head and looked at the broken plate. It crumbled into pieces and fell. Sangwoo mentally said that he needed to remember every little detail. He opened his eyes wide and looked at the falling fragments, thinking that he must learn everything his clones were capable of. After a while, the sunset came. A blue aura was coming from Sangwoo. The protagonist opened his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his chin and said that switching between the first and second clone was tiring. His vision started to blur. He covered his face with his hand and thought that his mana had run out and he was feeling tired, so he needed to rest. The protagonist was breathing heavily. He sat down on the bench and started thinking that the clone's movements were just crazy. They didn't doubt or fear anything at all, so they moved as they needed to. Sangwoo could feel the wind when the clone dodged the stick. He looked into the distance and thought that next time he would go with them, because he should see what would happen. If he tried it himself. Meanwhile, someone was walking towards him. A girl looked at the protagonist. The protagonist's eyes widened when he heard the girl call him teacher. He was standing in front of him. He opened his mouth wide and asked what she was doing there so late, and the girl replied that she had been studying at the library. Several bandits were looking at them from behind. While the protagonist and the girl were chatting pleasantly, a man was smoking a cigarette and smiling. The 3 men nearby were frowning and looking at the protagonist. One of them was holding a phone in his hand. The man frowned and began to apologize to the person on the call, saying that he only wanted to scare Jumbo Mo a little, but it turned out their conversation had been recorded. A drop of sweat rolled down his forehead as the interlocutor asked if his threats had really been recorded. The man lowered his head and shouted that he would find out everything, but the interlocutor reminded him not to say anything there and to stay away from Eugen's territory. The man stood illuminated by the yellow rays of the sun. His interlocutor also told him not to mention any connection with the Heisen Guild. The man turned red with anger when the caller told him to call himself just a simple street hooligan. He smashed the phone against the wall. The man started screaming and kicking the phone. Suddenly, he turned around because he heard someone ask why he was angry again. The man in front of him was smiling and saying that he hadn't seen him in a long time. Kunok smiled widely, looked at the man, and then asked what had happened. 3 cigarette butts were lying on the ground. The 3 of them stood in front of each other, and Kunok asked if the man had really done nothing and just let them go. Kunok took a cigarette in his hand and said that he knew this would happen when the man got excited about joining the first guild in the country. The man looked down and said that the guild told him not to go near the Eugen territory. Kunok looked at the long-haired man and told him to find some part-time work. The man then looked into the distance and saw Sangwoo sitting on a bench. He immediately extended his hand and pointed at the protagonist, exclaiming that he was the one who had recorded him on video. He immediately walked toward him, but Junsak ordered him to calm down. The man was holding onto the corner of a wall, watching the protagonist from around it, clearly furious. They were looking at Sangwoo, who was happily chatting with Yang. The girl looked at the protagonist and asked what he was doing there. He replied that he was just training. Then they both looked away because someone called out to them. A man was walking toward them and talking about how their little brother owed the protagonist something. Junig was walking toward him, smiling. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek, and he said that he had no idea who these people were. He saw that the man was grinning angrily. The protagonist widened his eyes and immediately remembered what was going on. The protagonist stood up and asked what he could do to help them. The man frowned deeply. He opened his mouth wide and started shouting, but Junak smiled and asked him to calm down. Junak smiled creepily and said that he heard the protagonist had a video of his little brother making a mistake due to his emotions. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek. Junjak suggested they delete the video and peacefully disperse. He held out his phone and asked if they would really let him go if he deleted the video. Junjak also held his hand and said that he didn't like doing tedious work either. The protagonist's hand began to shake. Junjak lowered his head when the protagonist asked if there was any guarantee that they would really let him go. The man smiled, put his hand to his chin, and said that Sangwoo was smart because he really wouldn't leave there without getting beaten. Sangwoo hung his head, and Jongmek said that he wasn't smart enough to delete the video right after recording it, so now it made no difference. I opened her mouth wide in excitement because the protagonist quietly told her to run as soon as she had the chance. The bandit had already started to stretch his arms. The protagonist frowned and mentally said that he didn't think he'd be in such a difficult situation so soon. He got into a fighting stance and said that he would beat them all up. The bandit pointed at him and laughed, saying that he was quite confident in himself. The two men ran toward the protagonist, and Junyak stood behind them, telling them to beat the boy up good. Sangwoo dodged a punch, then another. The man kicked him, and the protagonist bared his teeth as he flew back. Then he was hit on the chin. Hai opened her mouth wide and started screaming his name. Sangwoo fell to the ground. Blood came out of his mouth. He started to get up, thinking that it didn't work the first time. He was lying on the ground behind him. The girl had materialized some kind of sphere. She held the sphere in front of her and shouted at them to step back. Sangwoo bared his teeth as he looked at her. His eyes widened in surprise. The girl was shaking in fear. The man looked at her in shock and wondered if she was really awakened. Hunyo then hit him on the back of the head and asked. Displeasure filled the air. Were they really scared of a schoolgirl? Held the sphere in front of her. Hunuk smiled and asked what would happen if they continued to advance. She opened her mouth wide and shouted at them to step back. Hanok-jo rushed at her. She bared her teeth, and Hying shot the sphere at them. The ball flew into the man's stomach area. In a moment, everything was engulfed in fog. The men covered their faces with their hands. The bandit's smile was visible through the mist, and he said that awakened ones were now like stones on the road. His t-shirt had burned off, revealing his tattooed body, and then he said there was nothing to brag about. He immediately raised his hand and told Hang to grow up. The protagonist quickly blocked the punch. He frowned at the bandit and said it wasn't over yet. Sangwoo punched him back. The man's hand relaxed and his mouth opened wide in surprise. The protagonist bared his teeth. Junio grabbed his face and stepped back. The protagonist remained in a fighting stance, baring his teeth again, thinking that he was starting to understand it wasn't enough to just copy the clan's movements. The man swung his fist, and Sangwoo, looking at his shoulder, realized he should move in advance to avoid being hit. The young man dodged and thought about how a punch wasn't just about swinging one's arms. He imagined the structure of the muscles and mentally noted that the momentum starts from the legs, then moves to the waist. He swung, thinking the momentum then transfers from the waist to the arm. The protagonist delivered a powerful punch. Another bandit attacked him from the side, and he realized he couldn't avoid it. The bandit would hit him. The protagonist took the blow and counterattacked. The bandit fell to the ground, and Sangwoo remained in his stance, breathing heavily. Junak smiled and asked if he really knew how to fight. His eyes glowed red, and he said he was hesitant to hit someone who couldn't even swing his fist properly. Sangwoo stood ready and thought that he still felt the pain from the last fight. He blocked the attack, thinking that he had withstood it before. But if Junak was this strong, did he really have a skill related to enhancing muscle strength? The protagonist clenched his fists and mentally exclaimed that he couldn't just let him hit him like that. Junak ran at him, smiling. The protagonist hit him back. Then again, the thug closed his eyes and called the protagonist a name, then immediately reached out toward him. The young man punched the thug in the face, thinking he needed to hit him hard and knock him out. Junjio swung his hand, but Sangwoo ducked and dodged. He then delivered a powerful uppercut. Another thug lying on the ground watched them. Sangwoo's eyes widened in surprise. Jun grinned widely. His face seemed to glow and the veins on his arms lit up. The thug swung his arm and said that Sangwoo was already a corpse. Venos Shah stood his ground and thought he needed to dodge such a swing. However, suddenly his leg was grabbed. The protagonist lowered his head and saw the thug holding his leg. He smiled and raised his head, realizing he'd been caught. Junak hit him, and he fell. He opened his mouth wide and exhaled all the air from his lungs. Haeyang began to cry and scream. The protagonist hit his back against a pole. He knelt down, clutching his chest, thinking about how hard it was. He lowered his head, struggling to breathe, as Jun continued to mock him. The boy clutched his chest, breathing heavily. He looked at Jun with a frown. Jun took a wide swing, about to hit. The protagonist thought, "This is the end." Everything around him became foggy. Juni opened his mouth and groaned in pain. The protagonist looked up in shock. Hong had attacked him with her ability. Two bandits were lying on the ground, cursing. They charged at her, but the protagonist shouted that she should have run. Sangwoo's clones immediately dealt with the remaining two bandits. Hyang's mouth opened in surprise as she looked at the second clone. Junak turned around, wondering what was going on. The protagonist raised his hand, wiped the blood from his lip, and said that he could finally breathe. Sangwoo clenched his fist as Junsak started yelling at him. The boy smiled and looked at him, then jumped off the wall and landed in the air. He looked down and thanked him for the practical test. Then Sangwoo kicked him, and Jun fell. After a while, the boy was sitting up, trying to catch his breath. Jung Myuk was unconscious. The other bandit was also lying on the ground. The system notified the protagonist that he had gained muscle strength and endurance, and that his cloning skill had been raised to level 3. The protagonist smiled while looking at the system window. He then raised his head. The clones were running toward him as he lay down and closed his eyes. Night had fallen. The girl wrapped bandages around her arms. The protagonist asked her why she didn't run away when she had the chance. She turned around and said that she didn't think that was what he wanted to say. Hang's eyes widened and she said that she was really surprised and still couldn't believe that the famous rookie hunter was actually a clone of Sangwoo. She remembered how the first clone had stood in front of the protagonist. The boy put his hand to his chin and asked her not to tell anyone about this. Had blushed, looked at him, and said that she understood and she kept her mouth shut. They then walked to her house. She turned around and winked at him, saying that only her left hand was hurt and therefore it was okay since she would still be able to hold a pen. She looked away and said that, since his student was hurt, why didn't he receive the amount of homework? But Sangwoo replied that she had finished everything in the study room. The girl looked down and said that he only had a good memory for this kind of thing. Sangwoo grabbed his neck and thanked her. He smiled, looked at her, and said that he thought he was able to win because she delayed the enemy. The girl blushed and closed her eyes, then exclaimed that she had played an important role today. He frowned and said that a thank you alone would not fill her stomach, so he could thank her when they ate meat. She raised her finger and asked him to promise her that. After a while, the girl raised her hand and said that she was going home. The protagonist smiled and promised that he would do everything to feed her meat until she was full. Then they turned around and walked home. The protagonist turned around and looked at the clones. He asked them why they were following him, since they had to work hard, but they replied that it was late, so all the training centers were closed. The protagonist picked up he gave them the stick and said that they could train in the park. The action takes place at night. A month later, Junmo called the protagonist and asked him how the plan was going. The protagonist sat near the clones and said that now even he could shoot at plates, and his cloning skill level had also increased. He now had a third clone. Junmo raised his head and congratulated him, noting that he would be able to learn even faster now. The protagonist smiled and said that Junmo would be surprised when he saw his stats. The man's mouth opened wide in surprise when Sangwoo asked if it would be possible to request 3 F-class hunting territories for tomorrow. Sangwoo closed his eyes and asked if it would be difficult, and Junmo replied that he would get them no matter what. Junmo wrote something in his journal and asked about the time. The protagonist said that he would send the clones to train in the morning and then to the hunting territory in the afternoon. The protagonist hung up and looked at the clones. He pointed at each one with his finger and gave each one a different task. The clones started running out of the room, and the protagonist yelled at them to come home before noon. They picked up their weapons, but Sangwoo ordered them to leave them at home. Sometime later, the young man was watching a video on how to hunt monsters. He sat in front of the screen and thought about what he saw from the clones' training, that they were good at learning and able to copy and reproduce almost any movement, provided it was physically possible. His eyes widened, and he wondered what would happen if he studied all the monsters and how to hunt them properly. He watched the video while sitting at the table. Sometime later, it was morning. 3 men were walking around the room. The protagonist looked at them with displeasure and asked if it was already noon. He then pointed and ordered them to take a shower and go eat. The clones started changing clothes, and the protagonist thought about how he had reviewed the guides for most of the FF-class monsters, and now he needed to check if they could follow these instructions. The protagonist imagined the progress chart of the hunt in his head and mentally said that he would monitor and gain hunting experience with the familiar skill. During the break, he would study Mana Plus. Since the familiar skill consumes a lot of mana, he would not be able to maintain it for long. He took out his phone and said that Mr. Agent Junmo would be coming soon. The 3 clones were sitting at the table, eating, and the protagonist ordered them to get ready as soon as they finished eating. The 4 of them left the house to meet the agent. Junmo looked at them in shock and said that they had become quite scary, and Sangwoo said that even he felt uncomfortable around them. Junmo crossed his arms and said that the territories were ready. He had reserved 3 places not far from each other. The clones got into the car, and then Junmo asked if Sangwoo was coming. He smiled and said that he would participate using his familiar skill, and he needed to train his mana breathing technique. So he wanted Junmo to just bring the clones to the hunting grounds and report back. They arrived. Smoke began to come out of the car's exhaust pipe. The protagonist put his hands on his hips and said that it was his turn. He opened his mouth and began to inhale slowly. A faint blue aura was emanating from him. He thought about relaxing his body and concentrating on his feelings, as well as ignoring sounds and focusing on himself. He closed his eyes and thought about how he felt when using a skill. The protagonist imagined a raging aura and mentally said that when using the familiar or cloning skills, he felt as if energy was coming out of his body. He closed his eyes and mentally said that the energy he felt that time was circulating in his body. A faint aura was emanating from him. He felt as if there was a core in the center of his chest. This core seemed to have grown. His eyes widened in shock because the system notified him that he had received a meditation skill that increased some of his stats. The scene shifts and we see corpses lying on the ground and monsters running around. A man crawled to the side and wondered what these monsters were doing here. The man cried and said that this was an F-class dungeon and they had just come to hunt alien fish. That kind of monster shouldn't be here. Suddenly, a monster with a terrifying mouth bit into an alien fish. This monster bared its sharp fangs and was holding some kind of sword in its hands. The man's eyes widened in surprise as he saw himself in the reflection. This terrifying monster was behind him, and he began to cry and scream in fear. Blood splattered to the sides, and a shrill death scream was heard. Someone opened the car door. Junmo stood near the car and said that this was the last hunting ground. He looked at the 3rd clone and said that an alien fish with strong jaws lived here. Number 3 raised his head and looked at the building. Junmo picked up the phone and thought that he should send a message now since he had delivered all 3 of them. He frowned and thought to himself that one hunter in 3 different places was really an incredible ability. Meanwhile, Sanu was sitting in his room. The 3rd clone walked past the guards, and Junmo thought that, depending on the results of this hunt, there might be an uproar in the hunter industry. Meanwhile, Sanu was emitting an aura and shouting that he was a genius for getting the mana breathing skill so quickly. He then sat down in dissatisfaction, as the instructor on the phone had said that he shouldn't let the meditation and mana breathing skills that had appeared confuse him. He scratched his head and said that it seemed it wasn't that easy to get the skill he needed. He picked up the phone and said that the clones must have reached their places. Sangwoo closed his eyes and an aura appeared around him as he activated the familiar skill. One of the clones stabbed a rat with a knife. The protagonist opened his mouth wide and screamed. The clone wiped the blood from the knife on his hand, and the rat in front of him fell to the floor. The protagonist looked calmly at the clone and realized that the clone had no problems. Suddenly, more rats came running. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek, and he thought that he would soon find out if the guy had helped him. He remembered a man holding a white cloth and saying that giant rats were the most annoying fake-class monsters. The man put on his glasses and said that, in order to hunt them, it was better to gather in a group. The man took off his glasses and said that if a solo sortie was inevitable, there were other ways to deal with them. The clone immediately took out a gun, remembering that the man said that, since they ran straight ahead, you could just keep your distance and shoot at them. He really started shooting at the rats. One rat jumped him from above. A bullet wound was visible in the rat's skull. The clone immediately stabbed the monster in the spine with a knife, and the rat fell to the floor. The crowd of rats looked at the clone with red eyes. The man put his hand to his glasses and said that, if the hero got good at it, it would be an easy source of experience points. Another man was dragging a rat's body with him, and the first man continued, saying that it's not so easy to hit a moving object. The clone raised the gun in front of him. The shell flew into the air. The rat's spine was broken. Another clone was walking among some strange rocks. Suddenly, something rose from under the ground. A scorpion appeared in front of the clone. The monster immediately received a blow. The clone stood on the scorpion with a knife in his hands. The clone cut the monster, and the protagonist thought about how he could test their experience with the help of the familiar skill. The third clone was fighting against the alien fish, and the protagonist thought that as his stats increased, the clones would also become stronger. The first clone's eyes were glowing. The second was riding a dead scorpion, and the third was fighting against the fish. The protagonist was thinking that he would squeeze everything he could out of the F-class monster fields today. A man walked forward. They looked at each other and wondered why it was so quiet here today. Another said that they should have met at least a few monsters by now. A rat appeared from the shadows. They found many corpses and were stunned by how long those corpses had been lying there. It became light around them, and they started shouting that they needed to quickly pack the corpses into a box. Meanwhile, the sun was shining all around. The third clone was holding a knife in his hands, and behind him lay an alien fish. The protagonist looked away with displeasure, thinking that he seemed to have missed something. Suddenly, he opened his mouth wide and screamed. He opened his eyes wide and remembered that they had not collected a single corpse. The clones were standing in place, and the protagonist ordered them to go back and collect all the corpses of the monsters they had killed, and not resume hunting until they had collected them all in a box. Sangwoo began to cry and looked away, wondering what to do if someone had already collected the corpses. Suddenly he looked again, pointed at the monsters, and said that he saw corpses of alien fish there, but the clone said that he did not hunt them. The protagonist grinned angrily and said that every corpse was money, and therefore there was no time to act like a saint. He stood in front of the fish corpses. The protagonist grinned and said that if number 3 had not killed them, he had no idea what kind of monster had cut them into pieces like that, the clone muttered as he fiddled with the blade. He looked at his hand and said that it was not an alien fish. Sangwoo's eyes widened in horror. He saw a severed human hand on the ground. He turned around and saw a monster running through the bushes. The clone immediately picked up a weapon, and Sangwoo realized that something was definitely there. The blue sky shone above him. Suddenly he looked to the side, hearing some noise. A fish head fell to the ground. A terrifying monster stood behind the clone. He tried to turn around, but the monster immediately cut off the clone's hand. The clone lowered his head and began to think that he was in pain, but then he grinned viciously. Sangwoo took his own hand and began to scream in pain. He opened his eyes and screamed again. The protagonist, with his mouth open, looked at his hand. It was shaking violently. He sat down near the refrigerator in the kitchen. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek, and he thought that the connection had broken unexpectedly due to pain. He picked up the phone and said, "Now is not the time for this." Mo answered the call, and the protagonist immediately asked which hunting ground he had brought number 3 to. Mo looked away and replied that he had brought the third clone to the sewage treatment plant in Eek. The youth put on his boots and asked the agent to bring the other 2 clones there immediately. He frowned and said there was some problem with the hunt. The third clone was standing with his arm cut off, and the sword in the monster's hand glowed red. The clone began to fall and collapsed to the ground in front of the huge monster. The protagonist extended his hand as he got out of the taxi. The youth opened his mouth slightly. Looking into the distance, he saw a huge sewage treatment building in front of him. He frowned, realizing that the connection with number 3 was completely cut off. He opened the system window and saw that he would have to wait more than 6 hours before the skill would recharge. The guard at the entrance asked him to show his identification bracelet. The protagonist entered and saw Jun Mo. He felt relieved. Two clones were standing behind the agent. He stood in front of Jun Mo and told him that number 3 had disappeared. He added that there was another monster on the site besides the alien fish, and it was very strong. The protagonist put his hand on his chin and said that the monster had the head of a fish but a body with arms and legs. Jun Mo's eyes widened. He extended his hand and said they should alert the authorities and temporarily close the site down because that monster was called the fisherman. He introduced this terrifying monster and explained that it was a dank, even a group of E-class hunters wouldn't be enough to hunt it. Sangwoo put his hand on his chin and asked Junmo to alert the authorities and block the entrance to other hunters, but not just yet. Genmo looked at him in shock, because the protagonist said that he wanted his clones to go through the portal. The protagonist grabbed his own neck and said they couldn't just sit and wait. He looked up and said he wanted Agent Genmo to trust him. The man grinned tensely. And Sainu said he wanted Genmo to trust him just like he trusted his clones. The protagonist stood up, and an aura appeared around him as he activated the skill. The clones found themselves in the hunting area. They were walking through a dense forest. One of them took a gun in his hands, and Sanu said that they should first go to the place where number 3 had disappeared. They walked through the forest, guns in hand. The second clone raised his fist. He saw the sharp mouth of a monster. The monster was eating fish, not far from them. The first clone looked forward, and Sanu mentally said that he didn't think he'd be so lucky, as this gave him the opportunity to attack first. He looked at the monster from behind and said its stats were equal to an E-class monster, but his clones only had 53% of his strength, meaning they were still borderline F-class. He looked at the monster's bloody back and said that right now, it was not in the best shape either. He frowned, thinking that, considering his clone's hunting abilities, the task was doable. The clones crouched and began to aim. Sangwoo ordered them to aim for the head. After a moment, they began shooting. The bullets bounced off the monster's head. The clones opened their mouths in shock. The protagonist also opened his mouth wide, wondering if the bullets didn't work. The monster raised its head and screamed. It immediately jumped into the air. The clones jumped back, dodging the attack. Then, one of them swung his hand and stabbed the monster in the head with a knife, but only a scratch was left on the monster's neck. His eyes widened and he wondered if the sword had really left just a scratch. The monster immediately turned around. Its sword hit a tree and missed the clone. The second clone, standing behind, shot the monster in the back. He thought that the monster's large size made it difficult for it to swing the sword in the middle of the trees. The protagonist said, "He's big." The monster's sword got stuck in a tree. Then the monster cut the tree down with a stronger blow. Samu gave a thumbs up and mentally exclaimed that he should forget what he had just said. The tree fell to the ground. The monster stood over it. With his back to them, the clones ran after the monster. It was holding a sword in its hands and their attacks did not cause significant damage. The clones realized that their efforts weren't working. The monster clenched its fist and prepared to attack. One of the clones was thrown into a tree, and Samu wondered how they could hunt this monster if their attacks were so ineffective. A clone widened his eyes and recalled the bullets from earlier. He remembered that one bullet had bounced off, but the second had done a little damage. He aimed his gun, thinking about what would happen if he shot the same spot again. The bullet hit the monster and it screamed in pain. The protagonist opened his mouth and exclaimed that he had succeeded. He smiled and ordered the clones to feed the monster lead. The monster ran toward them. The clones continued to shoot and dodge as it tried to strike them. The monster covered its face with one hand. Blood was everywhere. It was still holding the sword, which now seemed to be burning. Its eyes turned bright red. It swung the sword and nearly hit one of the protagonist's clones. The clone blocked the attack with his hands, but was sent flying. The blow was too strong. Blood came from the clone's mouth, and Sangwoo thought that the monster had suddenly grown stronger. The monster continued fighting the second clone. Sanu looked at the monster's sword and realized that it might be the source of the power boost. It was reacting to the monster's own blood. The protagonist grinned and thought that this also meant the fisherman was badly injured. Maybe it was just a temporary buff. The first clone attacked and stabbed the monster, but the monster struck back and threw him aside, then stabbed him with its sword. The clone's eyes widened in pain. He grabbed the monster's arm, picked up a knife, and muttered that he knew this wouldn't end well. He swung the knife and shouted that if blood was to be spilled, it would flow harder from the monster. He began stabbing it repeatedly. The monster swung its arm, but the clone continued slashing furiously with the knife. He frowned deeply, overcome with fury. The monster clenched its jaw and raised its leg, preparing to attack. The clone was kicked and thrown back, clutching his stomach. The monster swung its sword again, but the second clone came to the rescue and blocked the attack. The two clones rushed forward. The monster stood in front of them, but they split up and attacked from both sides, slashing at it with knives. Blood poured from the fisherman's mouth. He raised his head and groaned in pain, then fell to his knees. The monster collapsed to the ground, unconscious, and a pool of blood formed beneath him. The clone looked forward, exhausted, then fell to the ground. The protagonist mentally said he couldn't take another step. He looked at the gun and noted that there were no more bullets. Hunting was over for today. Looking to the side, he said that he felt like he was about to die and needed to inform Mr. Junmo. He saw bloody footprints leading away. His eyes widened in surprise. He turned around and ordered the second clone to follow them. Lying on the ground, he looked at the pool of blood and thought that there might be a portal in that direction. Outside, a soldier reported that a D-class monster had been detected in the hunting area, so entry was now restricted to hunters. One hunter began arguing, frustrated, saying that he had spent so long gathering his team, but the soldier explained that hunters from the association would be arriving soon and they would update everyone later. Junmo watched all this from the side and mentally asked the protagonist to hurry. Suddenly, a scream came from nearby. Soldiers standing near the portal were shouting that they needed reinforcements and had to alert their boss. The monster was running toward the portal, its mouth wide open, screaming. Soldiers began shooting at it. The monster's sword had caught fire. It slashed a soldier and continued charging through the portal. At that moment, a clone of the protagonist emerged from the bushes, knife in hand. He threw it at the monster's back. The blade struck its head. A moment later, Sangwoo appeared in the air. He frowned and mentally exclaimed that he had to strike with all his strength. Then he slashed the knife across the monster's head. Blood splattered as the soldiers watched in shock. The protagonist stabbed the knife deep into the monster's head. The soldiers' mouths dropped open in surprise. The monster fell to the ground. The first clone cried out and gave a thumbs up, saying that it was really cool. Nearby, a man on the phone said that they had arrived. He looked ahead and said he would send a full report to his superiors after investigating. Looking at his comrades in the floor, he saw the monster's corpse. He lowered his head, wondering if it was the fisherman. One soldier looked at him and asked if he was from the association and what had happened here. The man nodded. The military officer explained that the information about a D-class monster appearing had been accurate, but it had already been dealt with by a hunter who entered the territory before the portal closed. This was an F-class hunting territory, so he didn't understand what a D-class hunter team was doing there. But the military man said that the D-class hunter or team was not responsible for the victory. The man frowned and asked what had happened then. The military man pointed at the protagonist and said that they were still investigating, but as far as they knew, that F-class hunter had killed the monster along with his clones. The man frowned, wondering if an F-class hunter with clones could really defeat a D-class monster. He inspected the monster's body and realized that all the wounds were single strikes, probably a strategy to deal damage without a special weapon. The protagonist was chatting pleasantly with Junmo, while the man watched from the side, wondering if it was possible to shoot a moving monster and still hit the same wound accurately. He turned around frowning, then walked past the soldier and said they could finish the investigation. They would check if there were any other D-class monsters behind the portal. The monster's corpse was still lying on the floor. The man walked up to the portal, wondering if he should tell the association that he was the one who dealt with the monster. The protagonist was wiping the blood from his face when he suddenly saw many system windows notifying him that he had improved his skills. The clones were lying on a bench, and the protagonist looked at them, wondering if they had survived thanks to their regeneration. Junmo turned to Sun and asked about the clones. The boy replied that they were injured, but since his skill needed time to summon them again, he thought letting them recover on their own would help increase their regeneration stat. Sangwoo put his hand on his neck and said that he felt a little ashamed to say that after asking for trust, but it had been dangerous. Junmo spread his arms and said that he thought the protagonist could hunt E-class monsters without a problem. The boy raised his finger and shouted something about a short sword. He walked past the crowd and said the monster had a unique short sword that absorbed blood. He reached for the sword lying on the floor and said that complete madness began when the monster's eyes turned red. Sangwoo thought he was going to die. Junmo grabbed the sword and said the boy should ask his clone to pick it up since it might be a cursed item. Sangwoo frowned and asked if that meant he couldn't use it. Junmo smiled happily and said that cursed items were quite rare, so they could be very expensive depending on their effects. He looked away and said that they could let the clone hold it for now. Then he added that it was time to call it a day as he couldn't stay much longer before the reporters arrived. He put his hand in his pocket and asked the agent if the item that fell out of the monster's head was expensive. He held out his hand, revealing an item. Junmo's mouth opened in surprise. He was holding a red gem. Junmo's mouth opened again in shock, recognizing it as a low-level gem but an invaluable one. The protagonist blushed as he looked at it, and Junmo mentally said it was very hard to tell him the truth. He widened his eyes and said that it was actually a cheap item since it couldn't be used on humans and had serious side effects, so it was very cheap. The protagonist immediately threw it to the ground. Junmo held out his hand and said that the other items would be quite expensive, so the protagonist shouldn't be upset. San lowered his head and asked Junmo to take care of the items he had collected. The door to the apartment opened and the three of them walked inside. The protagonist extended his hand and said that he would summon number 3 again first. Everything around him began to glow. His third clone appeared in front of him. Sangwoo gave him his equipment and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The protagonist took off his bloody clothes and crouched down on the floor. There was a sword in the box and the stone lay next to it. The protagonist said that it was time to take care of the items he had received. He picked up the phone and said it was a power-up stone. He had read on some website that the stone couldn't be used on humans, but it could work on a summoned creature, though it would turn it into a monster. Sangwoo put his hand to his chin and mentally said that a permanent strength increase of 5,000 sounded tempting, but he was worried about the side effects. The protagonist imagined a hungry and wounded clone and thought about how, under normal circumstances, the clone's wounds and suffering wouldn't be transmitted to him. Then he widened his eyes and wondered, what if turning into a monster would have an effect on him? He imagined himself as a snake. Junmo suddenly appeared in his mind, screaming and shooting at him to die. The protagonist closed his eyes and put the stone aside, deciding that he would not use it for now. He then turned his attention to the sword. He remembered how Agent Junmo had grabbed him from behind and told him that the clone should pick it up since it might be a cursed item. The sword was in a box and the protagonist began explaining that they had put it in there just in case so there would be no problem during transportation. Besides, it wouldn't be such a bad thing to sell it since it was an expensive item. But then he thought, why not use it before selling it? The second clone was ordered to pick up the sword. The clone reached out with his hand, picked up the sword, and raised it above himself. Sangwoo screamed, but nothing happened. The clone simply held the sword in his hand. The protagonist waved his hands and asked if that was all. The clone then reported hearing a voice. Sangwoo activated the familiar skill and an aura appeared around him. He frowned when he heard the sword begging for blood. He grabbed his ears and deactivated the skill, exclaiming that it was too loud. The protagonist looked at his clone and thought about how it didn't seem to affect him, except for the fact that the voice was very noisy. The clone lowered the sword and Sangwoo suggested that he use the sword for a while. Then, a system window appeared, notifying the protagonist that he had improved his regeneration skill. The protagonist looked at the clones and thought that resting must be helping them regenerate faster. He closed his eyes and said that starting tomorrow he would need to send them out to hunt. But since they were still like this, he put his hand on the bed and said that today they would all meditate to unlock the monobreath. Sangwoo closed his eyes and an aura appeared around him. Meanwhile, the sun was shining on the city and many people were walking along the streets, all going in different directions. Sangwoo entered the school and thought about how the vacation had flown by so quickly. He opened his eyes and wondered if it was because he had been busy leveling up his stats. Besides, his stats had increased significantly since he hadn't given the clones a second to rest. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. He cried and said that he didn't know he was so lonely and that no one even tried to pretend to know him. The protagonist peeked out from around the corner. Gando was sitting at the desk in front of the protagonist. He smiled and said that he didn't know he and Sangwoo were in the same class. He added that he had signed up for this class because he heard the teacher was generous with grades. The green-haired girl watched them from the side. She and her friend looked at each other, wondering if this was the same Sangwoo who used to be fat. The girls began to gape in shock, wondering if they should ask him out on a blind date. Jondo smiled and said that Sangwoo was popular now. The protagonist replied that he now understood why no one greeted him. He pointed at himself and asked if he had really changed that much. Jondo frowned and said he swore even Sangwoo's parents wouldn't recognize him. Sangwoo grabbed his head and said he was planning to go home for a while. Juno added that when he saw Sangwoo on the street, he barely recognized him. Then he smiled and offered him a drink after class, but the protagonist replied that he already had plans. Juno opened his mouth wide and asked what Sangwoo had said. The protagonist began to sweat heavily and explained that he had already made a promise and couldn't go with Jiando. The man began to spit in frustration and called Sangwoo a traitor who would go drinking with a girl. Sangwoo tried to convince him otherwise. He pointed to the other two men in the classroom and said they had already heard everything. The sun's rays illuminated the windows of the school as Jiando shouted that he would remember this day. At the building of the International Hunters Association, Ma appeared. There were many people in the room. One of the workers looked menacingly at the screen. The assistant, looking at his boss, said that the oracle had predicted a catastrophe. Michael, raising the corners of his lips, asked what the essence of it was. The man holding the folder replied that it involved the creation of a portal and the invasion of hundreds of monsters. The chairman lowered his head and asked if the location and date of the portal's appearance were known. He was told that the highest rank of the invading monsters would be A-class, and there was a high probability the portal would open within a few days. After looking at the documents, the assistant explained that the probable location was South Korea. South Korea appeared on the screen. After a while, a man could be seen shuffling his feet. Wane adjusted his tie and wondered what was going on and why there were so many people here. Suddenly, Miho's ears appeared and she loudly called out for Mr. The girl abruptly pushed Guildmaster Keenis off his seat. Mr., now on the floor, said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Guildmaster Yolo, clasping her hands, said that something big must be happening if even he was here. Wani, sweat on his face, exclaimed that he could say the same thing. Miss, walking down the hallway, asked if he had grown a mustache to flirt with her, to which he replied that he had simply been busy lately. A moment later, the boys entered the interview room. Room Hyung looked to the side thoughtfully. The man adjusted his tie and asked if it was Wanti. Miho sighed heavily and called him a boastful man. The gentleman standing by the window asked what had happened, to which he was asked why he was so cold, because they could at least greet him. Guildmaster Kainos, closing his eyes, objected that if he had finished he would take his place. Frowning menacingly, the boss added that there was only one tower. He, smiling broadly, said that he had heard the first team of the Kindness Guild had recently gone there. The interview participants wiped sweat from their faces and listened. There had been no news from them in the past few days, and the man became curious about how everything was going. Aelbrun extended his finger and exclaimed that it was enough. The guild leader, with his hands in his pockets, asked, "Didn't they say that the results weren't good enough?" and apologetically added that his memory was no longer what it used to be. The master's body was surrounded by bright flames. A drop of sweat ran down Mio's cheek. Wani spread his fingers fiercely. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A moment later, the association leader arrived. Grandfather raised his eyebrows and asked if something was wrong. The man narrowed his eyes angrily. A second later, he sighed heavily. The conference participants lowered their heads. Byung Han looked ahead in bewilderment. Sitting down on a chair, the association leader said that he was pleased to see all the guild leaders and first wanted to thank everyone for their response. Narrowing his eyes, Grandfather explained that their country had recently received a disaster warning from the International Hunters Association. Han smirked and wondered if it was the Oracle. The association leader opened his mouth and said that they had received information that a portal would open and monsters would pour out. Since there was a suspicion that A-rank monsters would be present, they were asking for the cooperation of the country's top guilds. The boy raised his palm and asked where and when it would happen, to which they replied that they had no specific details other than that the portal would open in their country. Bilgong opened his mouth wide and shouted if they were asking them to cover the entire country and wait until the portal appeared. Daing Hun, hiding behind a folder, said that that was why they were here, to hold a meeting on the matter. And all they knew was that it would happen soon. The young man raised his hand and exclaimed that they didn't even have enough hunters to complete their tasks, and wondered how they'd be expected to stop a disaster without proper information about when and where it would happen, and whether they would pay the hunters who would be sent to deal with the disaster. The grandfather scratched his forehead and thought about it. When he extended his fingers and asked if they wanted to hear his proposal, the association leader gave him permission to speak. Holding a piece of paper in his hand, the man explained that each guild should prepare a group of hunters who could be sent out immediately in case of an emergency to monitor the surrounding areas, and that during a disaster, all guilds should concentrate their main forces in the right place. The gentleman lowered his eyebrows and added that those guilds that refused to cooperate would be severely punished. He crossed his fingers and looked to the side. Daing Han, with sweat on his face, said that it was a reasonable suggestion and asked if anyone else wanted to speak. He explained that if there were no more suggestions, they would vote and have everyone raise their hands if they were in favor of the suggestion. After a moment, the guild leaders raised their hands and muttered that they were already in charge of patrolling their region. Nino shyly extended her hand. He smiled contentedly. The association leader sighed heavily, believing that they had come to an agreement. Taking out the documents, the grandfather exclaimed that, in that case, they would follow the suggestion of the Kindness Guild leader and asked them to protect their area and maintain close ties with each other. After a while, a wide street appeared. Sangwoo, holding his backpack, muttered that time flies quickly on the first day. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed the young guys. The stranger, smiling widely, said that she was his type, and would leave as soon as he shared his number. Hang, fixing her hair, replied that she had a boyfriend, to which the guy offered to be friends. The protagonist, with his hands in his pockets, asked what she was doing there. The girl, clenching her fist, called him baby and asked if he had arrived. The hunter, lowering his eyebrows, asked her again. The daughter Dial, taking the young man by the hand, exclaimed that she had been waiting for him for too long and added that they needed to go. After some time, the evening city was visible. Sangwoo, looking to the side, asked if the stranger had forced her to give him her number and if that was why they had left so quickly. Hyang explained that she had told him that she had a boyfriend and the protagonist had approached him at that very moment. The girl, opening her mouth wide, screamed that in any case she did not have a boyfriend. The protagonist, walking down the street, asked why she asked him to buy her meat today since she had classes. To that, Dokchil's daughter said that their school had an anniversary today, and the guy asked if that was why she wasn't in her school uniform and thought that something had happened. Contentedly closing her eyes, he asked if he could look away from her when she was in casual clothes, and if he wanted to take her number. The hunter exclaimed that he already had it. Suddenly, the young man reached into his pocket, taking out his phone. Sangwoo read a message from Jin Mo stating that the payment, minus all expenses, had been transferred to the account. Clenching his fist, the protagonist wondered if he had already earned 50 million and added that his clones were the best. Raising his finger, the protagonist shouted that she could choose any meat, even the most expensive. Hang exclaimed that she eats a lot and asked if he was sure he could afford it. In the evening, tall buildings were visible and the answer was heard that they would eat veal. The girl objected that it was very expensive, and the guy asked her not to think about money. A sign for Korean veal appeared. Food was being fried in a frying pan. The boys were happily snacking. The daughter, with her jaw open, told the teacher that it was delicious, to which he said that she was right. Han, with her eyes bulging, said that it was really expensive and asked again if he was sure he could afford it. The young man lowered his eyebrows and reminded her that he had asked her not to think about money and just eat. A moment later, the girl raised her hand. Sangwoo turned around and ordered more beef for 4 people. In the restaurant, people suddenly took out their phones. You could see how the guy was looking at the screen in bewilderment. A man appeared on the TV, but his image suddenly froze. A message about a disaster appeared on the screen. A sign warning of a monster invasion through a portal was visible, and it was said that a state of emergency had been declared across the country. At that moment, the boy's eyes widened in surprise. They heard that all residents were advised to check the location of evacuation sites and prepare supplies in case of a disaster. Jendo was crying and screaming, saying that it was unfair that Sanu was walking with the girl while they were walking the streets alone. The man with glasses glanced at Jendo and said they weren't even sure that Sanu was dating a girl. A moment later, he saw the protagonist in the restaurant. They were smiling at each other while talking about something. The man suddenly clenched his teeth and angrily said that he would kill Sanu. The phone in Jendo's pocket vibrated. When the boy picked it up, his friend, who was holding the man with glasses, asked him what happened there. Jendo frowned, saying that something bad was happening. In the chat rooms and on the forums, people were asking each other what was going on and saying that they wouldn't even go to the shelters. Barely holding his friend with glasses, the boy asked Jendo if it was too quiet for a disaster to happen. Shouldn't the siren have gone off? The protagonist walked out of the restaurant. When he came out, Sangwoo wondered what his friends were doing there. The two boys smiled, covering Chang-woo's angry mouth, and said they saw them eating together when they passed by. Was she his girlfriend? He and Hang blushed in embarrassment, and the protagonist answered sadly, saying that she was his student and he was just treating her for helping him last time. The girl bowed and introduced herself as Sangwoo, introduced his friends from the university. Sangwoo picked up his bag and handed it to the girl, saying that since they didn't have time to eat, he asked them to pack the leftovers with them so she could eat with her father and mother. Hai was happy and thanked the guy. Chang-woo and Jang Sun froze in shock when Sangwoo told Hyang not to go anywhere and to go straight home since her parents were probably worried. The guys realized that their friend was acting like a teacher. Slightly blushing from embarrassment, Hyang asked if they were going somewhere or if that was it for today. The guy raised an eyebrow in confusion, saying that her parents would not be happy if they went out somewhere after the alarm had sounded. His friends immediately called the guy a grump and an old man with disdain, which angered Sangwoo. The protagonist angrily pointed at them, ordering everyone to quickly go home. Sangwoo froze and looked away, hearing laughter. A couple of people were leaving the bar, having fun with their friends. The protagonist frowned slightly, wondering if he was the only one reacting so sharply because of anxiety. All the passers-by were chatting cheerfully, acting as usual. The guy picked up the phone. Soon Junman Mo picked up and Samu asked him if he had heard the announcement about the disaster. The man replied, saying that he was just about to call about it. Bowing his head, the man said that according to unofficial information, the association wanted to remain in this position for another 3 months. This was due to the fact that the location of the portal was unknown, but the number of monsters was terrifying. Beads of sweat flowed down Sangwoo's face when his acquaintance said that Sa-class monsters were expected to appear. If the portal opens in the capital, deaths are inevitable. Raising his hand, the protagonist asked if in this case it would be better to give people more information and tell them to be careful. Sitting on the sofa, Junmo said that the problem is the 3-month gap. If they notify people, it will cause irreparable harm to the economy and the most important industries of the country. The protagonist gritted his teeth and said that this way the association could say they warned people if something serious happened. Putting on his suit, Juno said that he was heading to the shelter and the hunting grounds should already be closed, so hunting was impossible. The events take us to Sasuo's house. Entering the room, he asked his clones how they were feeling. The second clone, sitting next to the first, said that everything was fine. Sunu became sad and looked away. He saw that number 2 was unharmed, but number 1 had serious wounds. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of the guy with a description of the cloning skill. Number 1 looked sharply at the original when he said that he would be summoned again. A moment later, a bright light illuminated the room. The summoned clone put on his uniform. Sunu handed him a cap, saying that he had better put it on so as not to get confused. Soon number 3 entered the room. Sonu turned to him, thought about it, and suggested that they go home. At night, the protagonist arrived at his parents' house. He went up the elevator, thinking about how long he had been gone. He reached out to the intercom. When the door opened, the guy held out a bag of goodies, telling his mother that he was back. The protagonist's mother opened her mouth and froze. Sinu narrowed his eyes and smiled, realizing that his mother really didn't recognize him. Raising her hand, the woman asked the boy if he was Sado. The protagonist scratched the back of his head and said that it was indeed him. His mother immediately became worried, asking him if he was hungry. The father left the room, asking if it was really Sangwoo. Suddenly, a joyful Jo appeared. She put her hands on her hips, saying that as soon as he returned, he should have looked for his cute little sister. A moment later, her eyes widened in shock. The protagonist smiled nervously. Looking at Jo, the girl froze, not recognizing her brother. The boy shed tears, remembering Jendo and his words. When he took off his shoes, his mother asked if he came with friends and why they were all wearing masks. Sangwoo replied that they were not his friends. Turning to the clones, he told them to take off their masks. The whole family screamed in horror and fear. Opening their mouths, all three clones took off their masks, revealing their faces. A moment later, the protagonist's mother's scream was heard from the house. Sitting at the table, Sangwoo calmed everyone down by saying that he had taken part in the Awakening program a month ago, and that his clones were his ability. Holding a cup of tea in her hand, the woman said that she had heard many young people were taking part in it, but she did not expect him to go too. The father, sitting opposite, asked his son if he had become a hunter now. He scratched his head and said that he was not going to hide it. The protagonist's mother frowned, saying that being a hunter was dangerous. Ju watched a video on her phone while her brother tried to convince their mother that his job was safe. Raising his hand, the guy said that an impending disaster had recently been announced, so they should go to a shelter. Stroking his chin, the father told his son that they had already packed their things just in case, but for now they needed to observe the situation. Raising his hand, he said that he still had to go to work tomorrow, so they couldn't just leave the house. Sangwoo frowned, realizing that they didn't know how serious it was like the rest of the townspeople. He gritted his teeth in anger. Sighing, the guy opened his eyes and said that, in that case, he would stay with them from now on. He also received a message that school was cancelled. Putting a bag of food on the table, the protagonist said that he had been at a restaurant, but due to the alarm he had to leave. Standing up, his mother told the protagonist that she would cook everything now, since he was probably hungry. Watching his mother leave, the guy mentally said that he should have visited his family more often. The clones looked at their mother in admiration. When she asked them if they would eat, they sadly bowed their heads when Sangwoo said that the clones could eat, but meat was too good a dish for them. Soon, various dishes were placed on the table. Soups and salads filled the space. The three clones sat nearby with a large bowl of rice. The family sat down at the table, getting ready to eat. Ju covered her mouth and asked her brother if he would get better if all the clones and he ate. Sangwoo replied saying that he would not get better. His mother smiled, saying that it had been a long time since they had a family gathering. The protagonist looked at his family peacefully. Suddenly, the walls next to him exploded. Sangwoo slowly opened his eyes through the darkness. Soon he saw the destruction caused by the explosion. The boy was lying on the floor, injured. He stood up, trying to understand what had happened. His eyes widened in shock, and he froze. The entire upper part of the building had been destroyed. A huge monster was raging nearby, and wyverns and other monsters were flying in the sky. The huge monster opened its mouth like Godzilla, and began to gather flames. A moment later, it shot a beam of flames. The stream of fire destroyed everything in its path. The protagonist, terrified, opened his mouth in amazement. He immediately looked at his unconscious relatives. Ju and his mother were lying on the floor, taking number one's uniform in his hands. He realized what had happened. The guy heard a crack and turned his head. Number two and number three came out from under the rubble. Approaching them, Sangwoo asked number three if he was okay after losing his arm. He replied saying that the bleeding had stopped. The guy grabbed his head. Number one had disappeared, and number three was seriously injured. He had not expected the portal to open so soon. Suddenly, his mother stood up. Seeing that all the family members were beginning to get up, the protagonist told them they needed to get out of there as soon as possible. His father looked back and felt anger and horror upon seeing his house in such a state. Taking a gun in his hands, Sangwoo said that the house was not important now. Looking at the monsters raging outside, he said the portal had already opened and the city was almost destroyed. The monsters grabbed everyone they came across. Some people were kneeling in front of the corpses of their relatives. One of the monsters dragged a man from a rooftop with him, while many ground monsters ran through the streets. Soon the protagonist gathered all his things. His father put on his bag and grabbed a bat. His son asked his sister if she had put everything on correctly. The girl examined herself and said the protective gear was a little big. Looking at the clone who had lost his arm, she asked if he was okay. Sui answered, saying that everything was fine with him. A huge body fell from the sky. A moment later it landed right in front of the protagonist. The orc trembled after falling from a great height, suffering terrible injuries. Sunu frowned upon seeing the monster fall from the sky. Watching another monster fall, the guy assumed that a portal had opened in the sky and that the monsters fell because they could not fly. The protagonist swung his dagger, killing the orc. The system notified him of a 0.001% increase in mana. Zu's hands trembled as he tried to open the door. The father and daughter tried to force it open, but they couldn't. The protagonist grabbed his father's bat and told him to step back. Sanu took the bat and used his kick skill. His eye glowed brightly. A moment later he struck the door handle. The handle broke and flew off, and the protagonist kicked the door open. The entire family froze in shock upon seeing this. Soon they reached the 12th house. Looking back, Sandu said that this simply couldn't be happening. The cars in front of them had been destroyed by the monsters that had fallen on them. Looking at his father, the boy asked how far it was to the nearest shelter. His father replied that they needed to walk about 2 kilometers. Somewhere off to the side, liquid was gathering into something. Bones were reuniting, forming skeletons. Stones and boulders formed the bodies of golems. The protagonist gritted his teeth when he saw this. He realized that these monsters weren't affected by the fall. Ju screamed and startled her brother, saying that they could use the underground tunnels because there was a temporary shelter there. The whole family immediately turned around and ran in the other direction. Sonu froze when he heard a man's plea. Turning around, he saw a man crushed by rubble, trying to get out and asking for help. Suddenly, the monster opened its eyes. It grabbed the edge of the rubble. The man began crying and stared at the monster in horror. The troll, a D-class monster, began to stand up. The protagonist's father frowned. He turned to his son, telling him that he needed to think rationally. They were in no position to help anyone. A drop of sweat ran down his face as he told Sin that it was time to go down. The protagonist closed his eyes, realizing that number 3 couldn't fight properly, and with only number 2 saving the man would be nearly impossible. The boy continued crying and screaming, begging for help. Sak turned around, realizing that he himself was not a clone that could be sacrificed using the skill. His eyes widened involuntarily in fear. He knew he would die if he stayed. Suddenly, his heart began to beat faster. His mother came down and told her son that it was time for them to go. The boy clenched his fists and called for his mother. Sa closed his eyes and told his family to close the doors as soon as they got downstairs. Ju and her mother frowned and looked up when they heard his words. Number 3 nodded when Sumbarat told him to protect the family with all his might. Ju objected, saying that he needed to come down. The father frowned at his son, asking if he was leaving. The protagonist smiled nervously and said that he was a hunter after all. A moment later, he and number 2 rushed forward. Number 3 grabbed Ju, not letting her escape. In a situation like this, where monsters fell from the sky and attacked people, only hunters gave hope. The protagonist struck the monster with a blow, throwing it back. The troll stood up and roared. Sano put the bat on his shoulder and told the clone to take the man to safety. Pointing at the monster with his hand, Sano told it to come to him. The man and the monster froze for a moment, staring at each other. The eyes of a certain monster flashed in the darkness. It was watching everything from the roof. From another building, number 2 grabbed the debris. He lifted a huge piece of the wall, freeing himself. The guy thanked the protagonist. The troll grinned widely, looking at its prey. The clone and the original looked at each other, and the clone said that it was clearly a huge creature. Number 2 took out his weapon. Sanu took out a crystal, saying they would use everything they had. Looking at the crystal in his hand, he said that now was not the time to be picky. He threw the crystal to the clone, telling him to eat it. Number 2 immediately took a bite. His body trembled, his skin changed color, and his pupil stretched. The protagonist watched the changes in surprise. Soon a heavily altered clone stood in front of him with a sword in his hand. The protagonist looked at the frowning clone and asked if he was still on their side. He answered affirmatively and briefly. The troll pointed at the clone with a puzzled expression, asking if he was on their side. The protagonist looked at his hand as the system reported an increase in strength. The two guys stared at the huge enemy in front of them. The troll raised his club and dragged it along the ground. A moment later he launched pieces of earth at them. One of the stones grazed the protagonist's cheek. He began knocking away the fragments at great speed. The troll extended his hand towards Sam. Number 2 cut the monster's hand with his sword. Blood splashed on Number 2. The protagonist looked at him and commented that the sword in the clone's hand was amazing. The monster roared in pain as blood spurted from the wound. It swung its club and began to attack. Dodging the blows, the protagonist was glad that the monster was slower than the fisherman. In a second he was near the monster's head and struck. The troll managed to block the blow with his hand. San opened his eyes wide, amazed that the troll's hand had already restored itself. With one strike, the monster threw the guy back. The protagonist rolled on the ground, beginning to get up. He gritted his teeth, realizing that the troll had strong regeneration. Its skin was not hard and was easily cut by Number 2, who now stood opposite the monster. However, all wounds healed within seconds. It was recovering too quickly. Suno gritted his teeth and frowned. It was almost impossible to damage such an enemy. When Number 2 dodged another blow, the protagonist ordered him to knock the monster down. Number 2 intercepted the weapon with both hands and cut the troll's leg. In a second, the monster fell to one knee from the wound. It opened its mouth and roared when its eye was hit by bullets. The protagonist, holding a gun, said that despite the regeneration, this would definitely blind the enemy for a while. At that moment, Number 2 cut the troll's other leg at great speed. Blood burst from the wound, and the monster's body began to fall. Its recovering eyes began to tear up. A moment later it stopped crying and opened its eyes wide. The protagonist appeared in front of him, activating the strike skill. The guy smiled, saying this was a great place to finish it. The bat distorted the monster's face. Sonu roared and his eyes sparkled with tension. With one blow he was able to throw the monster's body back. His face twisted from the pain in his hand. He involuntarily looked at it, realizing this was a side effect of the skill. Looking at the troll's body, the protagonist mentally noted that its strength was comparable to the fisherman. As he began to get up, he told Number 2 that they had to go. Shaking his clothes, he tried to find his phone. Not finding it, he asked Number 2 to give him his. The clone, who had now changed appearance, held out the phone. Taking the phone, Sonu laughed, telling the clone that if he went to the shelter like that, he'd definitely be thrown out. Suddenly the guy turned his head and froze. In the distance he saw a crowd of people running and asking for help. The guy massaged the bridge of his nose and thought. Events shifted to another part of the city. Planes flew overhead, their shadows covering the roads. Godzilla stepped on a car and scanned the area, looking for prey. It concentrated flames in its mouth again, but turned its head sharply when something hit it. A man with an outstretched hand faced the monster. Members of the 9th Rank Guild, Red Fire, gathered together to confront it. A man with a mustache and beard gritted his teeth in anger. The leader of the 7th Ranked Guild, Scorpion, shouted, saying they could not lose to other guilds. If they failed to break through at least one monster, they wouldn't receive their salary. Godzilla opened its mouth and roared as the teams of both guilds attacked it. Massive explosions began to shake the city. A plane continued flying overhead. The pilot turned his head, saying they had arrived at their destination. The hatch opened. Vunti and his group approached it. The man frowned at the ruined city. A group of monsters appeared in front of the plane. A machine gun emerged from the top of the aircraft. Moments later, bullets rained down on the monsters. A soldier looked at Vunti and shouted that the megalosaurs were moving away. The man turned to him and said that since several guilds were targeting them, joining now would cost them manpower. So, the plane calmly continued forward. The plane flew over the monsters. The hunter who had killed a monster didn't even bother to sleep. A guy was crushed by it. Another hunter tore the bracelet off a girl's corpse. Wanti looked at them angrily and called them bastards. The pilot sitting in the cockpit reported that several survivors were spotted 700 meters to the north. Wanti immediately poured mana into his eye. In the distance he saw a group of people. 2 guys were protecting the group from the monsters. The man froze in surprise, mentally noting that the guys were holding up well, but the number of monsters was too great for just 2 people to handle. Putting on a mask, he said he was heading north. Looking at the group members behind him, he ordered them to unite and begin the rescue. A moment later he jumped out, mechanical wings opened on his back, and thanks to them he was able to fly forward. The protagonist was breathing heavily while holding the bat in his hands. He had planned to return as soon as he finished off the troll, but everything went wrong. The goblin standing in front of him smirked. The people behind him looked at the monsters in fear. Sangwoo turned around and ordered the people to run to the shelter. They screamed, saying there were monsters behind them too. Attacking a goblin, the protagonist ordered number 2 to take care of the rear. The goblin jumped at the man with a grin on its face. Number 2 arrived in time and pierced the monster. Sangwoo grabbed his gun and shot the goblins in the head. He bowed his head, feeling exhausted. He could no longer use the strike skill due to the energy it consumed. Suddenly the space in front of him lit up brightly. A moment later a huge bird burst out of the rubble. Dodging the attack, the protagonist said that this creature had risen again. A fiery liquid began to gather near the monster's beak. Moments later it flew in all directions. The protagonist put his hands in front of his face, trying to block the attack. Drops of fiery liquid rushed toward the people. Number 2 stood in front of a woman with a child. He spread his arms wide, blocking all the projectiles. Blood burst from the clone's mouth. Sangwoo lowered the bat to the ground and cursed when he saw the state of the clone. The guy's hand was burned. Suddenly a paw appeared above the bird-like monster. Another monster pressed the bird to the ground with its paw. A tiger emerged from the shadows and opened its mouth. Sangwoo froze upon seeing the tiger. A goblin standing nearby also froze in horror. Number 2's body dissolved. Sangwoo looked back at the people. He collapsed onto the ground, not resisting the approaching paw. Suddenly, in complete darkness, something turned. The protagonist closed his eyes, expecting to die. Feeling no pain, he slowly opened one eye. Wanti was standing right in front of him, holding a sword. A cut appeared on the monster's neck, and blood began to gush out. The people nearby opened their mouths in surprise. Wanti turned to them and asked if everyone was okay. The protagonist, eyes wide, tried to say something when the tiger's head fell to the ground. Wanti introduced himself. The scene shifted to the shelter. A camera was set up above the door. Inside, people calmed down a little while bandaging their wounds. Some looked sadly at a man cursing in the corner. Ju demanded that number 2 let her go so she could save her brother. He replied that he could not allow it. The girl's hand trembled from the effort. Jude, barely holding back tears, screamed, asking the clone if, being a clone, he shouldn't prioritize saving the original. He replied that his priority was the original's team. Her father frowned at his daughter and told her to stop. The girl looked at him and asked if he wasn't worried at all, especially after seeing what was happening outside. The father answered that it was even more dangerous to go out. Besides, the creature in front of her was Sangwoo's skill. If the clone was alive, then Sangwoo was too. The girl frowned and tried to object again. The man turned to her and said he was convinced that his son truly worked as a hunter and they needed to trust him. If they went out, they would only interfere and force him to defend them. Ju looked at her father in shock, then lowered the hand that the clone was holding. Suddenly, both of them flinched when they heard a knock. Someone was knocking on the door and asking for help. Smiling, Ju assumed it was her brother. Her father immediately objected, saying that the voice was different. A man sitting to the side frowned and said the person didn't know the password. Perhaps he was from another house. The camera showed a human body. Ju ran forward, saying she would go open the door. Her father tried to stop her, warning that it was too dark on the camera. The girl smiled. As she approached the door, she saw someone behind the man and became certain it was her brother. Soon the doors began to open. The girl looked out, calling for her brother, but in his place she saw only a corpse. The corpse's legs were sliding along the floor. Huge claws were holding the corpse by the neck. Their owner, imitating a human voice, had been calling for help. Ju's eyes widened. The monster pushed the corpse away from itself, throwing it against the wall. Then it grabbed the door and stepped inside. The B-class monster opened its mouth, staring at its prey. The man sitting behind froze in horror. Everyone suddenly stood up and ran away. Only clone number 3 rushed towards the monster. He pointed his blade at the monster's eyes. Suddenly the clone froze. A huge claw pierced his body. The guy started coughing up blood. The limb of the monster had pierced his body. The limb also pierced Joe's stomach. Joe's father and mother immediately screamed upon seeing this and rushed towards her. The girl involuntarily turned to her parents. A moment later she fell. Number 3 frowned and grabbed the gun. He shot the emergency switch. The device broke and reported the detection of critical damage. The doors immediately began to close due to the activation of the emergency isolation. The clone's legs swelled from the strain. With a jerk, he and the monster jumped forward. The guy was able to hold back the monster while the doors were closing. Soon the doors closed completely. Wani stood next to the protagonist and asked for forgiveness for being late. Sangwoo, looking at the outstretched hand, remembered that this man was conducting the awakening program. Grabbing the man's hand, he introduced himself and thanked him for saving him. Wani smiled, saying that he hadn't done anything special because the video showed that Sangwoo had saved all these people. Although he had almost died, he hadn't escaped until the very end. The protagonist awkwardly scratched his head, saying that he couldn't leave when there were so many people there. Looking at the happy people, Wani said that conscience easily switches off in dangerous situations. The guy blushed with embarrassment. Wani, watching the guy, was surprised by his strange laughter. 5 minutes ago he was flying in the air. He frowned, looking at the battlefield. He saw how one of the guys covered people with his body. The man frowned even more and began to curse mentally. Suddenly, the guy's body dissolved, leaving behind only clothes. Soon the tiger appeared. Wani grabbed the sword, intending to save the guy. It was like a stream of light fell on the ground. Looking at the protagonist, the man thought about who that guy had turned into. Mona was when Sangwoo raised the bat. He asked him if he was a hunter. The protagonist answered, saying that he had registered recently. Smiling, the man asked what his skill was. Suddenly the guy's body shuddered in horror. Sweat began to flow down his face. He decided not to hide his ability since the man had saved his life. When he was about to say something to Wani, a stream of mana passed through his head. The guy felt a terrifying pressure. He lost contact with number 2. He immediately grabbed his sword. Sangwoo rushed away, asking for forgiveness from Wani and saying that his family was in danger. The man looked after the guy and shouted, saying that it was dangerous to go alone. Raising his mask, he told his subordinates through the radio to immediately track Sangwoo's location and take the survivors to a safe place. Then he looked at the sky. The protagonist, gritting his teeth, ran with all his might. His sword began to exude terrifying mana. Sangwoo's eyes turned red and blood poured out of them. The system reported the activation of the sprint skill. The sword in the guy's hand screamed, telling the guy to die. Explosions were happening all over the city. The man with the mustache extended his hand, concentrating the flames. The system notified him of the activation of the fireball skill. The flames hit the huge monster. His comrade turned to him and said that they needed more firepower, so it was better to concentrate on one point. Suddenly, the monster's foot landed on him. The man frowned and shouted, telling the support team to disperse. The man with the huge blade swung it. The veins on his head bulged from the strain. The monster's skin was too thick. Its poison could not penetrate inside. He jumped back. Then his temporary comrade said that the situation had gotten worse, and now was not the time to compete. They needed to cooperate. Suddenly both hunters turned around when someone laughed at this idea. Hyung stood with his hands in his pockets and said that he came because he heard that a lot of money was waiting for him there. He grinned and extended his hand. The monster raised its head as its body was illuminated by light. The two hunters looked at the sky in shock. Hyung looked at the falling meteorites and said that absolute strength does not necessarily need to work with someone. The events take us to the shelter. The father was crying, telling Ju not to fall asleep. The girl raised her trembling hand, saying that it hurt. The woman cried and picked up a bandage, asking her daughter to hold on for a bit. Suddenly, something hit the door hard. The father immediately looked at the door. He saw a cut in the middle of it. A moment later, the doors began to bend. The monster made a hole and crawled through it. The people felt horror and trembled. Chua was crying, telling her parents to run. The firefly opened its mouth, telling everyone to die. The parents sat next to their daughter and did not think of running away. The mother closed her eyes while crying. The protagonist suddenly appeared behind the monster. His eyes were shining brightly as he looked at the enemy. The firefly froze and looked at the guy. The protagonist's father turned around and saw his son. He was angry. He exuded a terrifying aura. The boys crying inside the shelter begged for help. The protagonist's eyes turned very red. The monster did not move, waiting for the enemy to act. Sanu's father cried, looking at his son. The protagonist himself looked at his unconscious sister. His body froze and straightened, and his eyes returned to normal for a moment. The guy frowned. His body began to tremble with anger. Once again falling into a berserker state, he rushed forward. His body disappeared from the spot in an instant. The monster raised its limb. The guy ended up behind the monster with a wound on his shoulder. He struck the monster. Blood spurted abundantly from his wound. The monster stuck out its tongue and called out to Ju. The blade of the sword was covered in blood. A bright fire appeared around it. The protagonist clenched his teeth furiously. Sanu swung the blade. The monster moved to another room. It swung its paw. Sharp claws appeared right in front of the boy's face. Vaunt's subordinate saved him, leaning on him with her whole body. The man frowned menacingly. Firefly raised a trembling paw. The girl smiled widely and said that she had caught her comrade. Guild member Keenis jumped into the air. He managed to kick the enemy and throw him back. The woman frowned and noticed that her friend had serious injuries. The young man raised his head and screamed. The huntress assumed that this was a berserker state. A magic circle appeared in her hand. The system reported that the mana transfer skill was activated. A bright light illuminated the faces of the heroes. The student opened his mouth wide and began to breathe heavily. The sword fell from his hand. The awakened one asked if he was okay. His subordinate put her hand on her comrade's chest and said that he was in a bad way, so they needed to kill that monster quickly. Blood gushed out of the protagonist's mouth. The girl started giving him a heart massage and asked him to be quiet since he had an open wound. Wanchi's eyes widened when he heard that his comrade's sister was injured. Sangwoo grabbed his ally's hand. The boy began to cry and asked her to quickly save his sister. The man asked him not to worry. His hand was engulfed in blue fire. The monster looked up and opened its mouth. Suddenly the monster spread its paws and screamed. Guild member Keenis's eyes flashed with fire. He said that neither his friend nor his sister would die today. The young man closed his eyes. The awakened one walked toward the monster and promised that everything would be over soon. Baeng Hoon was sitting at the desk in his office. A voice said that an emergency evacuation was needed because the situation was getting out of control. The old man spread out documents on the desk. The heroes walked down the hallway. The guild member said that they would prepare everything as soon as they were ready. The man looked away when someone called out to him. Hyung smirked and said that he wanted to consult with him. The bodyguard asked him to watch his words. The head of the association raised his hand, calming him down, and asked what was wrong. The guard trembled when the guild head asked him to leave them alone for a while. Baeng Hyung closed his eyes and nodded, giving silent permission to leave. The door of the office opened. The awakened one asked if his colleague was going to evacuate all the people at once. The old man sat at the desk and explained that they had to minimize the losses, so they needed to declare the expected damage from the invasion and evacuate the people. The hunter asked if he was really going to tell them everything. The man frowned and asked what he was talking about. With a sly smile, he said that they didn't even know when it would happen, and asked why his comrade wanted to announce the invasion of Seth-class monsters if it would lead to the entire country being locked down for 3 months. The man looked at him sternly when the guild leader asked what would happen next. Placing his hands on the table, the awakened man said that anyone who lost anything would blame the association for everything and explained that he didn't know if he would still have a head on his shoulders by then. The hunter walked behind his colleague and added that this didn't bode well for him either. The association leader asked what he should do in that case. Hyung looked back and suggested that he not tell them about the monsters being Sith class and hide the scale of the upcoming invasion. He widened his eyes and said that in that case the people would blame themselves for not evacuating in time. Looking out the window, the guild leader said that he wouldn't call a meeting or announce anything to the public, and asked why they needed to announce this meeting in the first place. Bang-hun gritted his teeth and asked if his comrade understood how many people could die because of this. The scoundrel smiled widely and said that that was the good part. Punching the wall, the awakened one explained that the more people died, the more they would be needed, and added that the army would not be able to do anything about monsters higher than D class, so the population could only count on them. The hunter put his hand on his colleague's shoulder and said that he misunderstood something. He grinned and asked if he thought this was just a suggestion. The old man closed his eyes. The man grabbed his head and a voice announced that the Megalosaurus guild members were currently going on a raid. The clone was doing push-ups on his fists. The protagonist was eating chips. Lying on his copy's back, Sangwoo ordered him to work harder, as the rate of strength growth had slowed down lately. Smiling widely, the boy decided that this was the best skill. His duplicates earned money for him, and his stats grew without his participation. He concluded that now he had nothing to worry about for the rest of his life. The young man looked at his phone and noticed that the agent had arrived. Clouds were floating above the building. The student ordered number 1 to wake up because it was time to earn money. Junmo smiled when he saw his friend raising his eyebrows. The awakened one greeted him and explained that he needed number 1 to be with him in the territory for rabbit hunting. The hero stood by the car. The man asked where number 2 was. The hunter replied that he was exercising. Smiling, the CEO of JM asked why his client didn't do it himself and suggested that it would help him get stronger much faster. The protagonist looked at him awkwardly and confirmed this but decided that the clones were the ones who should do it. Putting his hand to his chin, Sangwoo said that he never seriously wanted to become a hunter and remembered that he now had a decent income. The agent explained that he had a lot of potential that he was not using to the fullest. The guy raised his eyebrows and decided that it would be enough for him to just take care of himself. The manager opened his mouth and realized why his friend ended up like that. A giant cut appeared on the boy's chest. The student's eyes widened in horror, and he asked what was happening. His friend's eyes turned black. Juno said that this would be enough for him. Blood gushed from the wound. The awakened one backed up and crashed into something. His family members were standing there, and they all had black eyes. The hunter grabbed his wound and began to breathe heavily. His mother smiled and asked why he became a hunter. His father was outraged that the boy abandoned them and left. Jo gritted her teeth and asked her brother to save her. The protagonist's eyes filled with tears. Sangwoo jumped out of the hospital bed and screamed loudly. The boy opened his eyes and tried to catch his breath. The sun's rays illuminated the hospital room. The young man looked away when someone suggested that he was having a nightmare. When he crossed his arms over his chest and said that he should not move suddenly, the student grabbed his shoulder and realized that it was the man who saved him. The man said that he had a very deep wound. Guild member Kindness raised his eyebrows and said that according to the doctors he was very lucky. The awakened one looked at him dumbfoundedly and thanked him for saving him. The hunter replied that it was not that important, and said that he wanted to talk to him about many things. The door of the room opened. He added that it was not his turn now. The boy's worried parents ran into the room. The protagonist smiled when he left the room. The couple tried to find out if everything was okay with their son. Holding the documents in his hands, the doctor reported that the operation was a success. The doctor looked at the papers and explained that, for now, they needed to continue monitoring, but the patient was recovering quite quickly. In a month he would be able to return to normal life. Sangwoo widened his eyes in fear and asked how many days had passed since the portal opened. It turned out that 4 days had passed since then. The woman approached the bed and said that most of the large monsters had been taken care of, but according to rumors there were still many low-class monsters left. The guy scratched the back of his head and said that he didn't remember much about what happened before he lost consciousness. Suddenly the young man's eyes widened. The student looked at his parents and asked what had happened to his sister. The doctor looked at the couple, pursed their lips in disappointment. The awakened one asked if everything was okay with Jay. The hunter opened his mouth in horror and asked why they were silent and what had happened. The girl was lying on a cot, hooked up to a ventilator. The doctor said that they had taken care of her wounds, but she had been infected with a man absorber virus. The protagonist pressed his hand to the glass. The hospital employee frowned sadly and explained that people usually get the virus from monsters that come out of the portal, and that the disease absorbs and decomposes the mana of its host. The girl's eyes were closed. Although it happens quite rarely, sometimes the virus begins to absorb mana, depriving the host of the ability to live normally if the characteristics of the mana are ideal for it. Looking at his sister Sino, asked if she could be cured. Standing next to the window, the doctor replied that it was impossible with the current development of medicine because the virus synchronizes with the mana of the host. He added that the only way to keep her alive is to maintain the level of mana in her body. The doctor frowned and said that they could try to find an S-class healer or get an item like a mandre or an elixir from the other side of the portal, but the chances of that were slim. The guy opened his mouth and realized that it would cost an incredible amount of money. The hospital employee adjusted his glasses and confirmed this. The young man looked down in disappointment. The student grabbed his IV and decided that everything would have been different if he hadn't been distracted by others in the memory. The man was crushed by the rubble of a building. The awakened one widened his eyes in fear. The hunter took a wild look at his reflection and realized that he should have put his family first. One of Tae's subordinates grabbed Ji-woo. A little later, the wounded girl was lying on the ground. The wound on the protagonist's shoulder began to bleed again from overexertion. The doctor opened his mouth wide and called out to him. Sangwoo remembered the giant tiger and realized that he should have been stronger. Firefly crawled out of the cave. The IV line wobbled. The doctor called for a nurse. The guy bent the IV stand. The doctor asked him to stop before the stitches came apart. The young man pressed his hand to the wound. Tears streamed down his cheeks. The student thought about how he could have saved everyone if he had worked a little harder. In the memory, a happy family was having dinner at the table. The silhouette of Jiwoo appeared, lying on a hospital bed. The heroes were sitting at the table and chatting about something. Sitting on his bed, the awakened one looked down. The hunter frowned sternly. The protagonist heard some noise and looked away. Amrit entered his room holding a heavy bag in her hands. The girl greeted him and apologized for the sudden visit. Raising his eyebrows, Sangwoo thanked her and asked if everything was okay with her family. The girl approached him and told him that their house was damaged, but they managed to take refuge in a shelter. The guy was happy about this news and assumed that Doksal had asked her to come. The young man looked down. The schoolgirl explained that her father had contacted his superiors and found out that he was in the hospital. There were bottles in the box. The student asked his friend to address him a little less formally because in this case it would be more acceptable. The awakened one opened the drink and asked her to speak in a way that would be more comfortable for her. The student shyly knitted her eyebrows and agreed. She patted his hand and wished the teacher a speedy recovery, as they needed to continue their lessons. The hunter looked away from her sadly. I flinched when the protagonist called out to her. Sangwoo smiled and declared that he would no longer be tutoring her. 2 weeks later, the bright sun shone through the hospital building. The doctor's mouth dropped open in surprise and he was amazed at how quickly his patient had recovered. Folded underwear was lying on the shelf. The doctor asked if all hunters were like this. The boy unbuttoned his hospital gown and denied it. The robe fell onto the bed. The young man packed up his usual clothes. The student put his hand to the scar on his chest. The awakened one lowered his head and explained that he could not continue working as a tutor because of what happened to his sister. The girl's mouth dropped open in amazement. The hunter raised his eyebrows and apologized to her. Smiling, the girl asked him not to worry about it and thanked him for everything. She headed for the exit and assumed that the teacher did not want to talk to her anymore. Fixing her hair, the schoolgirl asked him not to regret it and promised to enroll in that university. Suddenly, the student stopped. Kat folded her hands behind her back and said that she would find herself a boyfriend. The girl looked back and urged her friend not to even think about taking back her words. The protagonist adjusted his tie and shirt. His parents were sitting in the waiting room. Jiwoo was lying on her bunk. Sangwoo headed for the exit and thought that he had no more time for regrets. The guy frowned sternly. The taxi sped down the road. A dossier on Wanti appeared on the Hunter wiki page. Looking at his phone, the young man recognized that it was the leader of the Kunis Guild. The driver turned around and said that they had arrived. The car door slammed shut. The young man looked up. In front of him was the main building of the Kunis Guild. The student walked inside and looked away. The office worker smiled and asked if he needed any help. The awakened one walked up to the counter and explained that Vonnet had asked him to come over so they could talk. The girl raised her eyebrows and said that it was impossible to arrange a meeting without an appointment. A man with a beard turned his head and asked her to stop. The stranger approached the hunter and asked if this was the same Sora. The protagonist looked at him and confirmed it. The woman gave him a puzzled look. The guild member said that this was their guest. He waved his hand and asked the guy to follow him because the captain was already waiting for them. The guild leader was sitting at the table in front of a photo frame. Von T, his eyes wide, heard someone address him. The doors of the office opened and the assistant said that Seinu wanted to meet with him, to which he received the answer that he should come in. The protagonist threw sweat on his face, said hello. The man leaned on the table and said that he was glad the boy had left the hospital and asked if he had been discharged much earlier than the doctors had prescribed. The protagonist raised his eyebrows and said that it was all thanks to his kindness, so he decided to go to him right after being discharged and wanted to thank him again for everything he had done. The guild leader closed his eyes and said that he had only done what was obviously necessary. The young man opened his mouth and exclaimed that he would not have said that. The boy folded his palms and explained that Vaunt had saved his family and he had provided quick medical care in such a situation, so the protagonist was immensely grateful and could not express it in words. Wani lowered his head and said he was also interested in why they had gone to such lengths for them. There was a laptop on the table and Sanu said that the hospital had mentioned they were given separate rooms. The man's face began to sweat as the protagonist continued, stating that the guild had also provided temporary housing for his parents, paid the hospital bills, and covered Jiwoo's mana infusions. He asked if they could tell him the reason for such generosity. A moment later, the guild leader clenched his fist. The protagonist's eyes widened as he heard that the guild leader also had a sister, but she was currently missing along with her teammates. The man wiped away his tears and said that maybe that was why he saw a reflection of himself in the boy, and that he had indeed let his feelings get the better of him, but he had not done it to be thanked or to make him feel obligated. Smiling slightly, he muttered that, regardless, he had achieved the latter. He then asked why the boy wanted to see him as soon as he recovered. Wani lowered his eyebrows and began talking about the ability the young man had demonstrated last time. The young man crossed his fingers and listened as the guild leader explained that his clones had real bodies and the ability to act independently. The one who had saved the people in the other town was also a clone. The protagonist exclaimed that he hadn't planned to hide it and confirmed that this was his skill. The head of the Kunis Guild tensed his hand and thought to himself that he had been right. The man sitting across from him explained that he needed his strength and asked him to help them save the first Kunis Guild. Getting up from the table, the man added that, just like he had saved the other survivors, he did not expect anything in return, nor did he offer this request as a repayment for the support he had provided. The assistant looked down and heard that only he had a chance to save his sister and the other members of the first squad. Wani, closing his eyes respectfully, asked for help. Sanu scratched his forehead thoughtfully. The protagonist remembered how he had lain on the floor in a pool of blood screaming that his sister was injured, begging someone to save her. A moment later, the protagonist crossed his fingers and said that he had already saved his family once, and now it was his turn to help them. The man, hearing this, opened his mouth in satisfaction. The sun's rays fell on the chairs as the guy added that he would do everything possible. He was thanked. The young man, grinning, exclaimed for them to tell him what needed to be done to save them. After some time, Sangwoo was holding a long stick in bewilderment. Several katanas appeared, and the protagonist asked where they were. He was told this was the training ground of the Keenest Guild. A small room was visible, and it was explained that the walls were very strong so he could use his skills freely. The protagonist looked at Wani and asked if they should prepare to rescue the team. Wani replied that there were two reasons why they should. First, the sooner they set out, the higher the chances of successfully rescuing the team. But they had some time to spare. The man, his jaw hanging open, added that thanks to his sister's abilities, the first team had an incredible amount of supplies that would last for at least 8 months. The second reason was the level of the dungeon. The gentleman explained that despite their guild being considered an elite B-class representative, the first team had suffered and was unable to leave the dungeon. He asked if the boy understood what was waiting for them. The protagonist frowned and replied that he wanted to say it was too dangerous for him for now. The guild leader raised the corners of his lips and said that it was true, but there was one way. Lowering his head, Wani said that people showed incredible strength at the threshold of death. Sangwoo listened, sweat on his face, as Wani explained that the sudden increase in strength in response to emergencies could tear muscles and break bones, but it also resulted in the growth of one's characteristics. Suddenly, a magical aura surrounded the man's body. He exclaimed that this kind of power was what he was currently lacking. He had survived so far thanks to his sense for battle, but that alone wouldn't help during the rescue mission. The protagonist, clutching the wooden weapon, did not understand. The gentleman added that he was very sorry, but this was the only way. The guild leader suddenly jumped up and said that he could resist as much as he wanted. Sometime later, tall buildings appeared in the chat. The protagonist greeted someone and said that he was fine, just taking a short break from hunting, and that he was in the hospital, but there were no serious problems. The man bit his finger. Junmo looked at the phone screen. Suddenly, the guy's shoes appeared. The agent, hearing how he was addressed, opened his mouth wide and asked if it was Hunter Sangwoo. It was clear that half of the protagonist's face was very swollen. The gentleman's eyes bulged in bewilderment. The protagonist raised the corners of his lips and replied that it was him. Junmo's body shook, and he asked how it had happened. The protagonist, holding a bag in his hand, said that many things had happened and he had a lot to tell him. A moment later, the boy was adjusting the bandage on his cheek. The man, through the sweat on his face, asked if his sister had been infected with a virus during the... Looking at the boy, the agent asked if he was okay, to which he replied that everything was fine. He was told that mana characteristics differed even among family members. The gentleman, with wide eyes, asked if that meant he had also received a quest from the Kindness Guild. The boy said that it was because the guild leader had saved his family and himself. Biting his lips, Sangwoo heard that he was worried about not being able to contact them, but he had not expected that to be the reason. The protagonist explained that he had lost his phone, so he used the clone's phone and asked to change the contact number to his name. Junmo, raising his eyebrows, asked if he had managed to back up his contacts. The protagonist, opening his jaw, replied that he had not and wasn't planning to which the man clarified that it would be impossible to recover the old numbers. It seemed like a group of guys were drinking, and the gentleman asked how his friends and other important people were. The boy smiled contentedly, closed his eyes, and said that it would be better this way. The agent narrowed his pupils and asked what kind of wounds he had. The young man sitting at the table explained that it was about the task he had mentioned before and that the leader had told him he needed to raise his stats. So they were undergoing training, which left Junmo perplexed. The man clenched his fists and asked how they could have brought him to such a state, adding that he would file an official complaint against the guild. Sangwoo asked him to calm down, saying that he had agreed to this method himself. The protagonist, looking to the side, said that the younger sister of Wani, the guild head, was locked in the dungeon, and he thought that Wani's despair was greater than anyone else's. He also understood that feeling. The agent sadly raised the corners of his lips. The protagonist, spreading his fingers, exclaimed that he was the only one who had been beaten today. Pulling out the bag, the guy added that he was going to create clones and attack with them. A moment later, the gentleman sighed heavily and said that he would order healing potions the next day. The training room appeared, the hunter, putting his weapon on his shoulders, thanked him for the training. Wani, turning around, asked if he had brought a clone with him. The hunter, looking at Wani, turned to him and he said that he had finally arrived and was glad to see that he was working hard. The guild leader's pupils narrowed in confusion. One of the doppelgangers was menacingly gnawing on a bone. The youth, clenching his jaw, exclaimed that today would definitely be different. Junmel, holding a large box, informed the hunter that he had received what he needed. Sangwoo kept his hands in his pockets and said that it was to be expected from him since he worked quickly. The agent replied that he had bought them in just a day, so there wasn't much in there. The guys looked into the boxes, and the gentleman asked if it was enough. He received the answer that it was, and that the captain would also be surprised. The copies of the protagonist sighed heavily, and it was heard what all this meant. Wani, raising his eyebrows, asked what he had done with the clones. The protagonist, holding an artifact in his hand, explained that he gave them something to eat. Opening his mouth, he added that he had given them 60 precious stones. Throwing the unusual food to his henchman, the guy said that since the clones were considered summoned creatures, they could absorb them and the added characteristics would affect him as well. The guild leader's pupils narrowed in bewilderment, and he wondered if the hunter could use stones on the clones. The young man, taking out his sword, exclaimed that today he would go all out. Frowning, the man said that he could use whatever he wanted, be it a sword or a gun. A moment later, the copies rushed out and it was heard that he should try to kill him. One of the doubles hit the master. Suddenly, a clone of the protagonist appeared behind Wani. The guild master, defending himself with